Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Settle in wherever you are. Maybe you're listening from bed, maybe from a dark room with the lights turned low, maybe while the rest of the house has gone quiet and the day has finally released its grip on you. Wherever you are, I hope this next stretch of time feels calm, thoughtful, just a little strange in the way history often becomes strange when we stop looking at it from far away and begin stepping inside it. Tonight we're going somewhere recent enough that many people can still remember the headlines, but distant enough that the deeper reality of it is already beginning to harden into summary. A war that lasted 20 years. A war that began in the autumn of 2001 after the September 11th attacks, when American and Allied forces entered Afghanistan with the stated goal of disrupting Al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban regime that had sheltered it. A war that changed shape again and again, moving from airstrikes and special operations raids to counterinsurgency, patrol bases, village shuras, convoy routes, advisory missions, airport evacuations, and finally the withdrawal of US forces in August 2021. 2 decades, long enough for a young soldier to enlist near the beginning of the war, serve, come home, raise a child, and see that child reach adulthood before the mission ended. But tonight, we're not beginning with presidents, generals, policy memos, election speeches, or maps covered in arrows. Those matter. They matter greatly. But they are not where fear lives. Fear rarely begins in a briefing room. It begins in a vehicle rolling down a road that looks ordinary. It begins at a doorway. It begins in a crowded market where no one seems to be paying attention, and everyone might be. It begins in the few seconds after a radio crackles and before the message becomes clear. It begins when a soldier steps into a place where the ground itself might be waiting, and that is the question at the centre of tonight's story. What did soldiers fear most during the war in Afghanistan? Not what frightened them in a movie sense, not the loudest danger, not the most dramatic image, what stayed with them, what settled into their bodies, what made them scan a ditch, avoid a patch of disturbed earth, distrust a silence, hesitate before accepting a handshake, wake up before dawn with their boots already half-laced in their minds. Wars produce many fears, and Afghanistan produced its own particular collection of them. Some were ancient fears soldiers have known for centuries: ambush, isolation, bleeding out far from help, failing the person beside you. Some were shaped by the technologies and tactics of that war in particular: improvised explosive devices hidden in roads, walls, culverts, and animal carcasses, suicide bombers who could appear in civilian clothes, insider attacks carried out by people wearing the uniform of an ally, rockets fired at a base in the middle of the night, helicopters struggling through mountain air, vehicles moving mile after mile through terrain where almost any bend could become a trap. Before we go further, let me ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Are you listening late at night, when the world feels smaller and the imagination tends to open strange doors? Are you somewhere quiet, somewhere noisy, somewhere far from Afghanistan, but close enough to the subject that it still catches your attention? And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, from bedrooms and couches to night shifts, long drives, and corners of the world I may never see but can still picture, because you told me. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history that slows down and tries to understand what life actually felt like from the inside, it would mean a great deal if you gave this video a like, subscribed to the channel, and stayed with us through the evening. You do not have to do it immediately. Let the story find you first. Do it when something lands, when a detail surprises you, when a thought follows you a little longer than expected. Now, let us move carefully into it. Imagine a soldier arriving in Afghanistan for the first time. Not in a news package, not in a polished recruitment video, but in the real sensory confusion of deployment. The first impression might be the light. Afghanistan has a hard, bright light in many regions. a white glare off dust and stone that makes the horizon seem both very far away and uncomfortably close. Mountains can rise like walls. Valleys can open without warning. Roads may be paved, broken, or barely roads at all. The air might smell of diesel, dry soil, burned trash, sweat inside body armour, dust shaken loose from boots. Depending on the year and the location, the soldier may arrive at a large airfield like Bagram or Kandahar, or move onward to a smaller combat outpost, a forward operating base, or a temporary position surrounded by HESCO barriers, concertina wire, and an uneasy understanding that none of it makes danger disappear. NATO and coalition troops spent nearly 2 decades in Afghanistan under evolving missions, first through major combat and stabilisation efforts, later through training and advising Afghan forces. But the individual soldier often experienced those broad missions through much smaller units of time. The next patrol, the next convoy, the next radio call, the next return to base. A person can read about a war for years without understanding how much of it is waiting. That is one of the first things worth noticing. Soldiers in Afghanistan did not spend every moment in firefights. Many never fired their weapon in combat. Others did, repeatedly. But almost everyone became familiar with anticipation, the expectation that something might happen without knowing when. That uncertainty can wear at the mind differently than a visible threat. A soldier can prepare for a scheduled mission. A soldier can train for contact. A soldier can clean a weapon, check armour, review a route, memorise hand signals, study terrain. What cannot be prepared away is the simple fact that the enemy may choose the time and place. Not always, of course. Coalition forces conducted raids, offensives, clearing operations, and targeted strikes. But from the perspective of many troops moving outside the wire, the war often felt less like 2 armies advancing toward each other, and more like travelling through an environment where danger had been folded into ordinary objects, a pressure plate under dirt, a wire near a roadside wall. A motorcycle parked too carefully, a man watching too intently, a child who suddenly stops playing, a road that has been used for weeks without incident and is now different in a way no one can immediately explain. This is part of what made Afghanistan frightening for so many who served there. Fear was rarely confined to obvious moments. It leaked into routine. It entered the habits of movement, the way a gunner watched rooftops, the way a driver studied the road ahead, the way dismounted troops spread out rather than walking shoulder to shoulder, the way someone might hesitate before stepping where someone else had not stepped first. The terrain itself became part of the threat. In some provinces, the danger came through dense compounds, irrigation ditches, mud walls, grape rows, and narrow alleys. In others, it came through mountain passes, switchbacks, weddies, open valleys, and roads that forced a convoy to slow down just where slowing down felt most dangerous. People often ask what soldiers feared most, and they may expect one answer. Death, perhaps. That would seem obvious. But soldiers are not frightened in a single, clean way. Death may be present, but it is often filtered through more immediate fears. The fear of being trapped inside a burning vehicle. The fear of hitting an explosive and not knowing whether everyone in the truck is still alive. The fear of seeing a friend lose a leg. The fear of not reaching someone in time. The fear of failing to notice something small and important. The fear of carrying responsibility for a decision made in less than a second. The fear of shooting too late. The fear of shooting too soon. The fear of surviving physically while carrying the memory of one bad afternoon for the rest of your life. And Afghanistan gave those fears a particular shape because the war was fought so often among civilians. Patrols moved through villages where families were cooking, buying bread, repairing walls, tending fields, walking children to school, or gathering at stalls. Soldiers were trained to distinguish threats from ordinary life, but ordinary life and danger could occupy the same space. A man holding a phone might be calling a relative. He might be watching the patrol. A vehicle approaching a checkpoint might be driven by a terrified father. It might be carrying explosives. A crowd might be curious. It might be forming for reasons no one understands yet. This kind of environment did not allow the mind to rest fully. It demanded constant interpretation, and constant interpretation becomes exhausting. The soldier is expected to see everything clearly while knowing that nothing is always clear. This is one reason why the subject of fear in Afghanistan cannot be reduced to battlefield courage. Courage was there, certainly. So was discipline, training, loyalty, and humour. Soldiers told jokes in absurd circumstances. They drank bad coffee, complained about dust, argued about music, traded snacks, and built friendships intense enough to become family. They took photographs of sunsets over mountains and pretended not to notice how beautiful the place could be, because beauty felt almost inappropriate beside what was happening there. They made routines because routines keep people steady. Check the weapon, check the radio, check the tyres, check the convoy order, check the med kit, check the person beside you without making it obvious. In that sense, much of soldiering in Afghanistan was an effort to keep fear from becoming the only thing in the room. The war also lasted long enough to change what fear meant across time. In the earliest phase, American forces entered a country few of them had expected to fight in, moving alongside Afghan anti-Taliban forces during a rapid campaign against the Taliban government and al-Qaeda infrastructure. Later came years of expanding counterinsurgency operations, especially as Taliban attacks intensified in parts of the south and east. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, the war had become deeply associated with roadside bombs, patrol casualties, and the grinding difficulty of securing territory that might feel calm one week and lethal the next. Then came a shift toward Afghan security forces taking the lead, coalition troops moving more heavily into training and advising roles, and a new concern that became especially acute in some periods: attacks from within the very forces they were helping train. The final phase, culminating in the evacuation from Kabul in August 2021, carried still another kind of fear: crowd pressure, suicide bombing, incomplete information, and the knowledge that time was running out faster than order could be restored. So tonight, we will not treat fear as a single emotion. We will follow it where it went, into roads, into villages, into helicopters, into bases after dark, into the split-second judgment calls made at checkpoints, into hospital tents and medevac pads, into the strained trust between coalition troops and Afghan partners, into the strange quiet after a mission when everyone is back, helmets are off, and someone suddenly realises how close it came, and eventually into the years after deployment, when the war may be over on a calendar, but not always in the nervous system. There is something else to say before we begin in earnest. Afghanistan was not a blank stage on which foreign soldiers simply arrived and suffered. It was a country full of Afghan civilians, Afghan soldiers, Afghan police, interpreters, drivers, medics, labourers, and families whose own fears were often even more constant and even less optional. Many Afghans lived with violence not for a deployment of 6 months or a year, but through childhood, adulthood, and parenthood. Afghan service members fought and died in enormous numbers. Interpreters stepped into danger every time they stood beside coalition troops. Villagers navigated coercion from insurgents, suspicion from armed outsiders, and the daily calculations required to keep a household alive in a war zone. This story is focused on what soldiers feared, but the landscape of that fear was shared with people who could not rotate home. That matters. It should remain in the room with us as we move forward. Still, the soldier's fear deserves to be examined carefully because it reveals the lived anatomy of the war, not just what happened, but how it felt to move through it. History is often recorded by outcomes: cities captured, leaders removed, policies announced, troop levels raised or reduced, missions renamed. But the body remembers history in smaller units: a boot hesitating above gravel, a hand tightening around a steering wheel, a helmet speaker crackling with a message that causes everyone to go quiet, a medic reaching for gloves, or a radio operator repeating coordinates, a man in a turret staring at the same ridgeline for so long that every rock begins to look deliberate. And this is where we begin, with a fear so common in Afghanistan that it changed vehicles, tactics, training, budgets, and the daily habits of nearly every unit that had to travel outside a secured base. It was not always loud before it happened. Often it was invisible. It did not need to chase a convoy. It simply waited, buried, hidden, patient. The road ahead looked like a road. That was the problem. The road ahead looked harmless. That was part of what made it frightening. It did not announce itself as dangerous. It did not always run through a battlefield. Sometimes it curved between low mud walls. Sometimes it passed through farmland where green shoots pushed up from dry earth. Sometimes it cut along a mountain slope, narrow and dusty, with a drop on one side and rock on the other. Sometimes it was barely a road at all, just two pale tracks pressed into dirt by trucks, tractors, donkeys and years of feet. And yet for thousands of soldiers who served in Afghanistan, that road could become the most feared place in the entire war. A soldier could prepare for gunfire in a way that felt concrete. He could return fire, find cover, identify a direction, call out movement, wait for orders, act. A buried explosive was different. It did not need to expose itself. It did not need to move. It simply waited until the wrong boot, the wrong tire, the wrong metal weight arrived above it. In Afghanistan, especially as the war moved deeper into the years of counterinsurgency, improvised explosive devices became one of the defining threats of the conflict. Official assessments described IEDs as a major cause of US fatalities in Afghanistan, and by 2012 the army called them the #1 threat to coalition forces in the country. This was not fear in the abstract. It changed the way soldiers looked at the world. A clump of earth that seemed slightly fresher than the dust around it, a pile of trash left near a wall, a dead animal beside the road, a culvert under a low crossing, a patch of gravel that did not match the rest of the lane, a wire, a battery, a place where a motorbike should have been parked but was not. The ordinary landscape became a sequence of questions. Nothing could be dismissed too quickly. Nothing could be stared at forever. The patrol still had to move. The convoy still had to deliver fuel, food, ammunition, water, replacement parts, mail, people. The war still depended on roads, and the roads refused to be neutral. In the early years after 2001, the United States and its allies moved quickly through a very different kind of campaign, relying heavily on air power, special operations forces, and Afghan partners opposed to the Taliban. But as the conflict lengthened, foreign troops became more fixed to territory. They established large bases and small combat outposts. They patrolled villages, guarded highways, escorted supply columns, and moved repeatedly through the same provinces. That repetition created opportunity for insurgents. A road used yesterday might be ceded today. A track considered safe in the morning could be altered by afternoon. The more predictable military movement became, the more valuable buried explosives became to those trying to slow it, punish it, and force it to fear the spaces between bases. By 2009, US oversight reporting noted that IED incidents in Afghanistan had significantly increased even as their use in Iraq had begun to decline. What made the roadside bomb so psychologically powerful was not only its lethality, it was its patience. A firefight began, a mortar attack began, a rocket launch began. An IED could have been waiting for hours, days, sometimes longer. It changed the relationship between a soldier and time. Every mile rolled slowly. Every halted convoy raised tension. Every dismounted patrol felt a little like walking through a room where the floorboards might decide which step mattered. Soldiers were trained not to crowd one another, not to step directly in the same place without thinking, not to bunch up in doorways or choke points. They learned that curves, soft shoulders, bridges, road junctions, and narrow passes required special attention. Army training on IED recognition taught soldiers to watch, especially for likely emplacement areas such as bends in roads, culverts, slopes, and constricted terrain. This did not mean every soldier spent every hour terrified. Human beings cannot live at a full boil for months. They adapt. They laugh. They complain. They talk about home. They sleep when sleep comes. But adaptation is not the same thing as peace. It often means fear has become procedural. The fear no longer needs to shout. It sits quietly inside the checklist. It is there when the driver studies the tyre tracks ahead. It is there when the squad leader asks whether a route has been cleared recently. It is there when the gunner scans rooftops, but the passenger inside the armoured vehicle keeps looking down toward the shoulders of the road. It is there when someone says, almost casually, that the route has been dirty lately. Dirty. That word could mean so much. A road with recent finds. A district where devices had been placed repeatedly. A stretch of terrain associated with blasts or attempted attacks. The vocabulary of the war became practical because it had to be. Soldiers did not always say they were afraid of being torn apart by an explosive hidden in the dirt. They said the route was bad. They said the enemy had been active. They said the engineers were taking lead. They said they needed clearance. Beneath those plain phrases was an entire emotional world. The devices themselves varied. Some were triggered by pressure plates. Some were command detonated. Some were built into roads. Some were placed in walls, irrigation channels, paths and buildings. Some used military ordnance left over from earlier wars or captured from stockpiles. Others relied on homemade explosives. A 2012 Government Accountability Office report found that about 80% of the IEDs then being used in Afghanistan contained homemade explosives, primarily calcium ammonium nitrate fertilizer smuggled from Pakistan. That detail matters because it explains part of the impossible scale of the problem. A device did not always require advanced industry. It could be assembled from widely available materials, inserted into terrain, and force one of the most powerful militaries in the world to spend vast amounts of money, time, and attention trying to defeat it. That imbalance became one of the defining facts of the war. The United States built specialized vehicles, sensors, jammers, robots, training centers, and entire organizations devoted to countering IEDs. The Department of Defense created and expanded efforts through the Joint IED Defeat Organization, later transformed into broader threat response structures. GAO reported that between January 2007 and February 2018, roughly 9,000 IED incidents were directed against US and Allied military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, resulting in about 23,000 casualties. Another GAO report stated that roughly 75% of casualties in then-current combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan were attributed to IEDs, helping drive the rapid fielding of mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. The MRAP became one of the most recognizable machines of the war. Tall, heavy, awkward in some settings, designed with a V-shaped hull to deflect blast energy, it reflected a brutally simple reality. Ordinary trucks and lighter vehicles had not been enough. The question was no longer merely how to move troops efficiently. It was how to give them a better chance when the ground erupted underneath them. In July 2008, GAO noted that the Secretary of Defense had called the MRAP program the department's single most important acquisition program, precisely because of the need to protect troops from IEDs. The appearance of these vehicles in Afghanistan changed convoys visually and tactically. They also changed the emotional texture inside the cab. No soldier believed armour made them invulnerable, but there is a difference between moving through a bomb threat environment with thin protection and moving through it inside a machine built because so many others had not survived the blast. Yet armour created no magical solution. Afghan roads could be too narrow, too rough, too steep, or too fragile for the heaviest vehicles. Some missions required soldiers to walk. Some villages could not be understood from behind thick glass. Some compounds, orchards, canals, and irrigation lines had to be approached on foot, and on foot the fear of explosives could become even more intimate. A vehicle blast was horrifying, but there was still metal between the body and the explosion. A pressure plate beneath a boot left no such illusion. It was the person's own weight that completed the circuit. Dismounted patrols in Afghanistan sometimes moved through areas where pressure plate IEDs were hidden on paths, in fields, beside walls, and along likely foot routes. The danger was not only military. UN reporting repeatedly emphasised that pressure plate IEDs were indiscriminate, often harming civilians because they detonated under whoever triggered them rather than under a specifically selected target. In 2011, UNAMA reported that 69% of analysed IEDs were victim-activated, and 90% of those used pressure plate designs. Later reports continued to identify pressure plate devices as a major cause of civilian casualties. That matters for understanding soldiers' fear because the same quality that made these weapons horrifying to villagers made them horrifying to patrols. They did not distinguish. They waited for weight. Picture a patrol leaving a small outpost in southern Afghanistan. The morning is already warm. The soldiers carry weapons, water, radios, ammunition, medical gear, sometimes mine detectors, sometimes additional specialised equipment. The first few minutes outside the wire are often the most alert. Then the body begins to settle into rhythm. Boots crunch, straps rub, sweat gathers under armour. Someone scans rooftops. Someone else watches the ground. The patrol moves past a mud wall, then along a narrow lane where children may have walked that morning. Somewhere nearby, someone could be watching. Or no one could be watching. The device might already be there. That uncertainty is part of the fear. It turns the patrol into a conversation between training and imagination, with the body caught in the middle. Soldiers became students of the ground, not all with the same skill, and never with perfect confidence, but enough that the road stopped being a flat surface and became something to read. Disturbed soil, fresh digging, oddly placed stones, a wire crossing where it should not, a change in texture. Even the absence of normal village movement could mean something. In some accounts from the war, troops noticed that civilians had quietly disappeared from a route or were watching from farther away than usual. These signs might mean nothing. They might mean everything. And the only way to know sometimes was to keep moving. That kind of movement can be exhausting in a way difficult to explain to anyone who has not experienced prolonged vigilance. Fear of an ambush gives the eye a direction. Fear of an IED turns the mind downward, outward, inward, everywhere at once. Soldiers had to watch people, rooftops, windows, road edges, footprints, recent construction, parked vehicles, animals, culverts, and each other. They had to maintain enough awareness to act, but not so much tension that they became useless. One mistake could kill. Too much hesitation could also endanger the unit. That balance became part of professionalism, and professionalism did not mean the fear disappeared. It meant they learned to function while carrying it. The route clearance teams carried a special burden. Their job was to go first, before the convoy, before the patrol, before trucks hauling supplies or buses carrying troops or Afghan forces trying to move through contested areas. Route clearance units used specialised vehicles such as the Husky for detection and the Buffalo for interrogation, along with robotic systems and other equipment designed to identify, disrupt, or investigate explosives. Army accounts from Afghanistan described route clearance as a difficult, repetitive mission that never truly stayed finished, because a road cleared today might be threatened again tomorrow. One engineer unit tracked more than 4,000 combat route clearance patrols during a deployment and reported finding and clearing about 700 IEDs. There is something almost unbearable about the phrase route clearance when you pause over it. It sounds administrative. It sounds like a task on a maintenance schedule. But in practice, it often meant slowly advancing into spaces designed to punish movement. The Husky operator, sometimes seated alone in a tall detection vehicle for long stretches, was deliberately seeking the danger everyone else hoped not to find. An army article about one Husky operator described the mission plainly as looking for trouble, so others would not have to meet it first. That was the logic of the job. Put trained people, specialised equipment and reinforced vehicles at the front of the risk. Better a deliberate search than a supply truck discovering the device by accident. And still, no one pretended the work was safe. Army reports from route clearance units describe periods in which troops found multiple devices concentrated in small areas, or encountered repeated blasts and attacks over extended operations. In one account from 2013, engineers and infantrymen in eastern Afghanistan endured a 40-hour period involving a firefight and 10 IED explosions before returning to base. Another report described a day when route clearance soldiers found 6 IEDs in close succession. These examples matter not because every mission was that intense, but because they show why the road became psychologically charged. It could remain silent for hours, then become the centre of the entire war in a few seconds. The aftermath of a blast often fixed itself in memory more than the blast itself. The moment afterward could be confusing. Dust and smoke, radios barking, someone yelling for a medic, someone trying to count heads, a vehicle tilted, torn or burning, a soldier on the ground, the strange silence in one person's face, the frantic energy in another's hands. The first questions were immediate and practical. Who is hit? Is there a secondary device? Can we move? Where is the casualty collection point? Is the route still hot? The fear did not end at detonation. In some ways it sharpened. Insurgents sometimes placed additional devices near likely rescue or response areas, and teams had to help the wounded while still remembering the ground might contain more danger. The blast could be only the beginning of the threat. For the wounded, the road often became the dividing line between one life and another. A soldier might wake up later in a hospital in Germany or the United States, remembering fragments, or nothing at all. Others remembered every second. Army stories from the period include service members who lost limbs, sustained devastating injuries, or returned to duty after surviving pressure plate IEDs and roadside blasts. These were not rare enough to remain exceptional in the culture of the war. They became part of the background knowledge of deployment. Everyone knew someone who had been hit, or knew someone who knew someone. Everyone had seen photographs, training slides, memorial walls, damaged vehicles, or empty bunks. This is part of why soldiers feared the road even when they tried not to say it. Death was one possibility. Severe injury was another. But there was also the fear of surviving into a changed body, the fear of needing help forever, the fear of becoming the event that others carried home. Soldiers often worry about themselves less than outsiders imagine. What tears at them is the thought that their mistake, their movement, their choice of route, their decision to speed up or slow down might hurt the people beside them. A leader feared taking a squad down the wrong path. A driver feared missing a sign. A dismounted point man feared failing to detect what lay ahead. A soldier in the back of a vehicle feared hearing the blast and knowing it happened 2 seats forward. The emotional pressure extended beyond American and coalition troops. Afghan soldiers and police travelled the same roads, often with less protection, and Afghan civilians lived beside them. Cigar reported in 2016 that the Afghan army was enduring an average of 4 fatalities per day, mainly because of IED attacks. UN reports throughout the later war repeatedly documented the toll of these devices on civilians, including children. A buried explosive did not understand uniforms. It did not care whether the foot above it belonged to a foreign soldier, an Afghan police officer, a farmer, or a child walking a path used by generations. That is why the IED was not only a weapon against bodies, it was a weapon against movement itself. It slowed military operations. It discouraged commerce. It made civilians avoid routes they needed. It turned roads into political instruments. Whoever could make travel uncertain could influence daily life without holding every village or winning every firefight. The Army's own counter-ED writing recognised the need not only to disable individual devices, but to attack the networks that built, financed, transported, emplaced, and learned from them. The bomb was the final visible object. Behind it stood a system. For soldiers on the ground, though, that larger system often compressed into something much smaller. A patch of dirt. A beep from detection equipment. A hand raised to halt the patrol, the road ahead suddenly forbidden. Minutes stretched. A specialist moved forward while everyone else waited. A robot might be deployed. A vehicle arm might extend. Explosive ordnance disposal might be called. The soldiers watching from behind cover experienced a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because the device had been found before it found them. Dread, because its presence confirmed what they already feared. They had been moving through danger, and they might not have noticed it on their own. There are soldiers who will tell you that after enough time in Afghanistan they stopped trusting roads entirely. Others will say they trusted the training, the engineers, the equipment, and still felt their stomach tighten whenever the convoy slowed in the wrong place. Some feared certain roads by name. Some feared the first mission after arriving. Some feared the last mission before leaving, because superstition grows naturally where life feels unpredictable. The road could make rational people seem ritualistic. Check the same buckle twice. Touch the same photograph before rolling out. Sit in the same seat if it had been lucky so far. Laugh at the habit, then do it again the next morning. It is easy from a distance to focus on the explosion because the explosion is dramatic. But the fear lived mostly before it, in the long approach, in the waiting, in the hours of nothing happening while everyone knows something could. It lived in the fact that the safest looking path might be dangerous precisely because it looked safe. It lived in the understanding that any movement outside the wire involved negotiating with terrain the enemy might have altered overnight. It lived beneath the boots and under the tyres just out of sight. And that is why, for so many who served in Afghanistan, the road became more than a road. It became a test of nerves, discipline, patience, and trust. Trust in the soldier ahead of you. Trust in the person reading the ground. Trust in the driver not to drift where he should not. Trust in the engineers. Trust in equipment that had saved lives before but could not promise anything. Trust in routine, even after routine had been used against you. Every mission demanded that trust, and every blast threatened to tear it apart. Still, the patrols went out. Convoys rolled, engineers cleared, medics rode with the columns, Afghan forces moved with coalition advisors, supplies reached remote bases, villages were entered, bridges were crossed, roads were reopened, lost, reopened again. That is another part of the story that deserves saying. Fear did not stop movement. It accompanied it. Soldiers carried it as they carried water, ammunition, batteries, gloves, tourniquets, and extra socks. It became one more item on the load, invisible but never entirely absent. The road beneath their boots could kill them. The ground beneath their vehicles could vanish in fire. Yet even after years of blasts, training films, memorial services, reinforced hulls, long pauses at suspicious debris, and stories told in low voices after returning to base, soldiers still stepped out again when ordered, not because they did not understand the danger. They understood it too well. They went because the mission required movement, and in Afghanistan, movement meant entering a contest with the road itself. That contest shaped nearly every fear that followed, because once the ground could not be trusted, it became harder to trust the places built on top of it. The corners of villages, the compounds beyond the walls, and the people who might be watching from just far enough away to see whether the patrol had noticed what was waiting ahead. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from knowing the person trying to kill you may already be watching, while you have no clear idea where he is. Not far away, perhaps, not hidden deep in a mountain cave. He may be behind a wall. He may be at the end of an alley. He may be lying in a shallow ditch beside a field. He may have fired 2 or 3 shots from a rooftop, moved through a doorway, set his rifle down under a blanket, and by the time soldiers reach the spot, he's just another man standing among other men, looking as confused as everyone else. That fear followed troops through much of the war in Afghanistan. It was different from the fear of a roadside bomb, though the two often existed together. An explosive buried beneath the ground was invisible because it was an object. The enemy fighter was invisible because he could disappear into the life around him. He did not always wear a uniform. He did not always remain armed in public. He did not always stand still long enough to be identified. Coalition troops were fighting in a country of villages, compounds, mountains, orchards, irrigation ditches, valleys and market roads, against insurgents who often knew the terrain better, understood local movement better, and could decide when to appear and when to vanish. US and coalition studies of the war repeatedly described insurgents dispersing before raids, hiding weapons, pretending to be civilians, using civilian compounds as firing positions, and returning after operations ended. For a soldier, this meant the world outside the base could not be divided neatly into safe and unsafe spaces. A village was not automatically hostile. A man watching a patrol was not automatically an enemy. A quiet lane did not automatically mean an ambush. But none of those things could be ignored either. The fear came from having to interpret everything without ever being entirely certain that the interpretation was right. Picture a patrol moving into a village in eastern Afghanistan. The soldiers have already walked for an hour, their armour is heavy, their weapons are carried low but ready. The led man watches the path. Others scan roofs, windows, trees, side alleys, and the mouths of courtyards. Children appear first, because children almost always appear first. They watch openly, curious and unafraid in some places, cautious in others. A few men stand near a wall. An older villager steps forward to speak with the interpreter. Somewhere a goat is calling. Somewhere a metal pot knocks against stone. On the surface it is ordinary life, but the soldiers have been taught that ordinary life can change very quickly. A village that looks calm may be calm. It may also have gone quiet because fighters have entered nearby compounds and local families know enough to keep their distance. One classified analysis later released publicly found that in parts of southern Afghanistan, Taliban fighters sometimes warned civilians before ambushes near populated areas. An unusually empty village or market could be a sign that an attack was coming. That was not true everywhere, and soldiers could not rely on it as a simple rule, but it became one more thing to notice. Too many people in one place could feel wrong. Too few could feel wrong. This is the problem with fighting an insurgency among civilians. The soldier's mind begins collecting patterns, but patterns are not guarantees. A road with no traffic might be suspicious. A road with normal traffic might still be dangerous. A man walking away quickly might be frightened. He might be a spotter. A person carrying a shovel might be a farmer. He might have been digging where he should not have been digging. A phone could be used to call family. It could be used to track a patrol's movement. The war forced soldiers to live inside a continuous argument with themselves. Do not overreact, but do not miss it. Show restraint, but do not become passive. Remember that most people are not trying to harm you, but do not assume that none of them are. This was not merely a mental burden. It changed the way missions were conducted. Many coalition operations required soldiers to search compounds, question military-age males, meet village elders, speak with Afghan partners, and move through homes and agricultural spaces that were not built for visibility. Mud walls blocked sight lines. Doorways opened into courtyards, roof lines connected. Irrigation channels cut through fields and allowed movement below eye level. Mountain villages could cling to slopes where a person with local knowledge had routes invisible to newcomers. In northern Kunar and Nuristan, US military studies described terrain so restrictive, with high mountains and isolated valleys, that coalition forces could secure only limited population areas, while insurgents retained refuge in spaces beyond easy reach. For soldiers, this produced an unnerving feeling of being seen more clearly than they could see. Insurgents could watch patrol patterns over days or weeks. They could learn when convoys left, how troops approached a village, where vehicles slowed, where squads paused, where helicopters typically landed. They could decide not to attack when conditions were poor, and strike only when the odds were better. Some insurgent groups moved on motorcycles, gathered briefly for attacks, then dispersed again into nearby settlements or rugged terrain. Coalition reporting from Kandahar and Zabul described fighters who maintained intelligence networks, consolidated for assaults on government positions or patrols, and then scattered before follow-on operations could trap them. This is one reason the enemy soldiers feared most was not always the enemy firing directly at them. It was the enemy who seemed to own the waiting. The soldier was visible by necessity. He wore body armour, helmet, weapon, radios, gear, and often moved with a patrol everyone could hear approaching. The insurgent did not have to carry himself that way. He could choose a wall, a rooftop, a grove, a compound, a riverbank, or a ridgeline. He could choose to fire or choose to watch. That imbalance created a kind of helplessness soldiers rarely spoke about in simple terms. It is one thing to face a stronger enemy. It is another to face an enemy who can decide whether he exists in front of you at all. The first burst of gunfire often brought the hiddenness into painful focus. A round cracked overhead. Another struck a wall. Someone shouted contact. The patrol dropped, moved, returned fire toward the best estimate of where the shots came from. But in Afghanistan, especially in built-up villages or mountainous ground, the direction of fire could be deceptive. Echoes bounced. Dust kicked up from impacts. A fighter could shoot from one compound and move through another before anyone had a clean look. During several engagements documented in military histories, insurgents fired from rooftops, windows, civilian compounds, and elevated positions before pulling away. In one example from a Marine account in Afghanistan, Taliban fighters deliberately used civilian compounds as firing positions, trying to provoke heavier coalition fire that might harm local residents and damage the Marines' relationship with the population. That possibility introduced another fear that sat close beside the first one, the fear of being manipulated into making the wrong decision. Soldiers were expected to protect themselves and their unit, but they were also expected to avoid harming civilians. In a conventional battlefield with uniformed forces and clear front lines, that obligation remains serious, but is often easier to organise mentally. In Afghanistan, the line between active combatant and surrounding population could become difficult to determine in the moment. This did not mean soldiers had no rules or no discipline. It meant those rules had to be applied under pressure, in seconds, while rounds might be coming from an area where families also lived. The stress of that responsibility appears throughout official reflections on the war. US counterinsurgency practice increasingly emphasized protecting civilians and avoiding actions that would alienate communities. Military studies noted that raids and indiscriminate or overly aggressive operations could strengthen the insurgency by producing anger, revenge, and mistrust. In one documented case, a Marine sniper team mistakenly killed a farmer irrigating at night after believing he was planting an IED. Commanders later held a public shura to acknowledge the error and apologise. The fact that such mistakes could happen helps explain the mental tension soldiers carried during night patrols, village searches, and moments of uncertain movement. It is hard to overstate how exhausting that uncertainty could become over a long deployment. A soldier might return from a patrol without a single shot fired and still feel wrung out, because for hours he had been preparing to react to something that never fully appeared. He had watched every hand near a pocket, every roofline, every vehicle, every cluster of men, every bend in the road. He had tried to listen to the interpreter and watch the village at the same time. He had tried to appear calm while his senses remained stretched. Then he returned to base, cleaned his weapon, drank water, maybe ate quickly, maybe laughed about something pointless, and knew he might do it again the next day. There is a tendency in war stories to treat combat as the only intense experience worth describing, but in Afghanistan, the absence of clear combat could itself be intense. The threat of the unseen enemy turned non-events into strain. Nothing happened at the well, nothing happened while passing the bazaar, nothing happened during the meeting with elders, nothing happened in the orchard. Yet the entire time, soldiers had been ready for something to happen. Over months, that readiness could become a habit of the body. The shoulders stayed raised, the jaw remained tight. Sleep came lightly. Sudden noises drew attention before thought caught up. Some of the most memorable battles of the war showed what happened when the enemy did choose to reveal himself in force. The 2008 attack on the American outpost near Wanat in Nuristan was a coordinated assault involving insurgents armed with rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons. 9 US soldiers were killed in a battle that lasted hours and became one of the war's most studied engagements. The importance of Wanat for this story is not only the casualty count, it is what the battle demonstrated about an enemy able to exploit terrain, proximity, surprise, and local knowledge against a small force in a vulnerable position. The attackers were not invisible once the battle began, but before that moment they had achieved the essential advantage of invisibility, choosing when, where, and how to concentrate. At a smaller scale, soldiers faced that same principle on daily patrols. The enemy did not need to mass hundreds of fighters to create fear. A handful of men firing from a concealed location could halt movement, wound someone, and vanish. A single sniper shot could make an entire position flatten into cover. A brief attack could force troops to spend hours searching compounds while the people responsible were already gone. Even when insurgents failed to cause casualties, they could impose caution, time loss, and mental wear. The purpose of every attack was not always to win a tactical victory in the traditional sense. Sometimes it was enough to show that coalition movement could be watched and contested. This created a strange relationship between visibility and power. Coalition forces possessed helicopters, drones, optics, radios, armoured vehicles, artillery, and air support. In many engagements, those advantages were overwhelming once the enemy was located. But the insurgent's task was often to delay that moment of location. He had to avoid being identified before he had done what he intended to do. He could fire from within the visual clutter of a village, retreat through a compound, or disappear into rough terrain that could not be dominated simply by standing nearby. Military studies of Afghanistan repeatedly stressed how difficult it was to maintain control over dispersed rural areas without dependable local information and persistent presence. That is why intelligence from the population mattered so much, and why its absence could be so unsettling. A soldier might know that someone in the village understood where the fighters came from, where weapons were hidden, who had passed through in the night. But would that person speak? Could he speak without endangering his family? Did he trust the patrol enough? Did he trust the government enough? Did he expect coalition troops to leave next month, next year, or next week? Official accounts of the war repeatedly emphasized insurgent intimidation of local populations and the difficulty of building relationships in places where people feared retaliation. From the soldier's perspective, that silence could feel personal even when it was not. A squad had been attacked from the edge of a village, and afterward no one seemed to know anything. A device had been placed on a route used every day, and no one said they had seen it. A fighter vanished through a compound, and families insisted they saw nothing. Sometimes that was deceit. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was both. Soldiers had to operate without always knowing which, and that uncertainty could breed frustration that had to be controlled tightly if they were to avoid turning the whole population into an imagined enemy. The war therefore demanded a type of discipline more complicated than simple aggression. Soldiers had to remain dangerous enough to survive and restrained enough not to make the situation worse. They had to remember that villagers were not props in the war, but people living through it. They had to look at a man with suspicion without reducing him to suspicion alone. They had to recognise that children gathering around a patrol were still children, even if they might also unintentionally reveal where the soldiers were moving. They had to accept hospitality in some places and refuse it in others. They had to enter homes respectfully while searching for the very people who might have fired at them moments before. There is no easy way to train a person fully for that. Training can build procedures. It can simulate village streets, markets, interpreters, sudden attacks, role players, and false alarms. The US Army built detailed training villages to replicate Afghan operating environments, complete with host nation security forces, civilians, and insurgent role players. But a training village is still training. It cannot perfectly reproduce the burden of knowing that one wrong reaction in a real Afghan home might injure an innocent person, or that one delayed reaction might cost the life of someone standing beside you. This is where fear became entangled with judgment. A frightened soldier might become too quick to see threat. An overconfident soldier might become too slow to recognise it. The best soldiers tried to stay in the narrow space between those errors. They studied the behaviour of crowds. They learned local patterns from interpreters and Afghan partners. They watched how villagers reacted when a patrol entered. They listened when someone said a particular area had changed. They learned to understand that a fight might begin before the first shot, in the arrangement of people, the absence of usual traffic, the unnatural quiet near a road, the repeated appearance of the same observer at different points along a route. And still, there were limits. A soldier could be very good and still not see the enemy until the enemy chose to show himself. That fact bothered people more than they like to admit. It challenged the comforting idea that competence always creates control. In Afghanistan, competence mattered enormously. Training saved lives, patience saved lives, local knowledge saved lives, but control was never complete. A hillside could hide movement. A doorway could frame a threat too late. A compound could hold a family in one room and a rifle in another. A man who seemed to be simply watching could later be identified as part of an attack network. Or he could be exactly what he first appeared to be, a villager watching armed strangers move through his home. For soldiers already worn down by explosives, this visual uncertainty added another layer to fear. The ground might be false, the quiet might be false, the friendliness might be sincere or tactical or both. The enemy could exist nearby without presenting a target. There was no guarantee that bravery, good equipment, or alertness would reveal him in time. That was one of the hardest lessons of the war. Not every danger announces itself. Not every enemy looks like an enemy before the moment arrives. The result was a form of vigilance that became almost domestic in its regularity. Soldiers checked windows, they checked rooftops, they checked left and right at intersections. They checked the hands of men walking past. They checked whether the same blue truck had appeared twice. They checked the mood of a crowd without discussing it aloud. They checked each other's posture. Every gesture became part of a quiet system of survival. A newcomer might think little was happening. Someone who had been there longer could tell that everyone was working constantly. And because the enemy did not always remain visible after attacking, soldiers often had to carry the frustration of incomplete endings. A patrol took fire. The squad returned fire. The enemy withdrew. No one could say for certain who had fired. No weapon was recovered. No body was found. The patrol went back out again the next day. This kind of unresolved contact did not fit neatly into stories of victory or defeat, yet it shaped morale. It created the feeling that danger was everywhere and nowhere, that the enemy could inflict stress without exposing himself to the same degree of risk, that the war was always slightly unfinished. That unfinished quality became especially apparent around villages and compounds, because those were the places where the next fear gathered. It was one thing to wonder whether a man in the distance was watching. It was another to approach a doorway where someone might be waiting on the other side, where a family might be sleeping, where a fighter might be reaching for a weapon, where the wrong interpretation of a single movement could change several lives at once. The unseen enemy did not remain unseen forever. Sometimes he was just beyond the wall, just inside the room, just behind the next entrance soldiers had to cross. The village looked quiet from a distance. That was often the first impression. A cluster of mud brick walls, low roofs, narrow lanes pressed between family compounds, smoke rising from somewhere behind a courtyard, a few children standing barefoot in the dust, men watching from doorways or from the shade of a wall, maybe goats nosing at scraps, maybe a motorcycle leaned against a gate. Nothing in the scene, taken by itself, necessarily suggested violence. It looked inhabited. It looked ordinary. It looked like the sort of place where people had lived their entire lives and intended to keep living after the patrol moved through, and then the soldiers entered it, and everything changed. Outside the wire, roads could kill without warning. In villages, the danger became more personal. It came closer to eye level. It moved through kitchens, courtyards, rooftops, stairwells and doors. A soldier could study a road from a vehicle or through optics, but a doorway demanded physical commitment. At some point, someone had to cross it. Someone had to step from daylight into a room they could not fully see, where the first second mattered more than the next 10 minutes. A weapon might be inside. A frightened family might be inside. A wounded fighter might be inside. An old man might be sleeping behind the door. A child might move suddenly because children move suddenly. The soldier approaching that entrance did not have the luxury of pausing until certainty arrived. Afghanistan often did not offer certainty. It offered moments, and those moments asked for decisions. This fear was built into the geography of the war. Much of the fighting and patrolling in Afghanistan took place among people, not away from them. Coalition troops met village elders, searched compounds, conducted census-style visits, entered homes during operations, and tried to distinguish insurgent activity from civilian life without treating every Afghan household as hostile. Military histories from the period describe patrols moving on foot through villages, visiting homes, raiding suspected insurgent compounds, and relying on interpreters and Afghan security forces to make those encounters possible. In one operation in Musahi district, coalition and Afghan police teams went door to door through villages, speaking with household heads, collecting information, and sometimes being welcomed for tea, while on a few occasions encountering threats from residents. That range of responses captures the unease of the work. The same act of knocking on a door could produce cooperation, silence, anger, fear, or danger. Imagine a patrol halting outside a compound wall. The lane is too narrow for everyone to stand comfortably. Dust hangs low around boots. The interpreter is nearby, ready to call out. Afghan soldiers or police may be positioned forward, especially later in the war when coalition policy increasingly emphasized Afghan-led entries into homes and culturally sensitive sites. The gate is closed. No one knows exactly who is on the other side. Someone knocks, shouts, waits. There may be footsteps. There may be nothing. A dog barks from somewhere inside. A woman's voice appears briefly, then stops. A soldier watches the cracks in the door rather than the door itself. Another checks the roofline. Another turns slightly to watch the lane behind them. Even before anyone enters, the situation is already tense because everyone understands that a household can become a battlefield in less time than it takes to finish a sentence. In January 2009, NATO publicly emphasised stricter guidance for searching Afghan homes and religious sites, and later references to the July 2009 Tactical Directive noted that Afghan national security forces were to lead entries into Afghan houses except in urgent circumstances. Those policies were meant to reduce civilian harm and cultural offence, but they also reveal how sensitive and dangerous such entries had become. A doorway in Afghanistan was not simply an architectural feature. It was a line between competing responsibilities. On one side stood a military patrol that might be looking for a weapons cache, an insurgent leader, an explosives maker, or a man reported to have fired on coalition forces hours earlier. On the other side might be a family whose home had become suspect through no choice of their own, or a family sheltering someone under pressure, or a fighter using the house because he knew troops would hesitate there. The soldier approaching the entrance had to hold several truths at once. Most people in the village were not enemy combatants. Some enemy combatants used homes, courtyards and compounds precisely because those places complicated the use of force. Afghan homes were private family spaces with strong cultural meaning, and mishandling them could damage relationships for months or years. Yet a door opened too casually could expose the patrol to gunfire at arm's length. That tension was not occasional. It sat at the centre of village operations. The split-second decision could begin with movement. A hand emerging around a doorframe, a figure crossing a dark room, a person turning quickly, a sound from a side chamber. Soldiers were trained to identify threats, to avoid firing without positive identification when circumstances allowed, and to make use of force decisions under pressure. One army combat study from Afghanistan recorded a moment during fighting in which a commander refused to let a gunner engage a village without positive identification of the enemy, even though the situation was tense and there was pressure to respond aggressively. That detail matters because it shows the kind of restraint expected in these environments. Soldiers knew that firepower was available. The harder question was when it was lawful, necessary and wise to use it. That is easy to describe calmly from far away. It is much harder in the doorway itself. A soldier may have only a second to decide whether the shape moving inside is a threat. If he waits and the figure is armed, the person beside him could be shot. If he fires and the figure is not armed, an innocent person may die, and the memory of that mistake will not leave quickly, if it leaves at all. The public often imagines combat decisions as loud, obvious moments, but some of the most consequential judgments in Afghanistan were made in poor light, under stress, in ordinary homes, before anyone outside the immediate team even knew the moment had occurred. NATO's 2009 guidance reflected this reality by stressing proportional responses and care in engagements where insurgents operated among the population. The purpose was strategic as much as moral. Civilian casualties damaged trust and could strengthen the insurgency. The uncertainty did not begin only once a patrol arrived at a house. It built across the entire approach. Soldiers noticed which men remained outside and which disappeared. They noticed whether children still hovered near the patrol or had suddenly gone away. They noticed if a village seemed unnaturally empty, if livestock was unattended, if doors that were usually open were closed, if a crowd seemed to watch one compound more than another. None of these signs guaranteed anything. That was the burden. The absence of proof did not mean safety. The presence of suspicion did not mean guilt. Patrols had to move through that grey area without letting it become an excuse for panic. Military accounts of counterinsurgency in Afghanistan repeatedly describe the importance of local information, relationships, and understanding village dynamics, because visible terrain alone could not explain what soldiers were entering. The room inside a compound could be small and dim, especially when entering from the brightness outside. Eyes needed a moment to adjust, but the situation might not grant one. There could be blankets, stacked grain, clay ovens, bedding rolled along a wall, cooking pots, tools, sacks, trunks, children pressed into a corner, an elderly parent trying to understand the shouting, or men ordered to sit in one place while others searched. What the soldiers were looking for might be hidden among all of that. Weapons could be concealed. Explosives could be stored in domestic spaces. Documents, radios, or components might be tucked away where they did not immediately stand out. Search operations in Afghanistan often required troops to move through places that were unquestionably civilian in character, while remaining alert to evidence of insurgent activity. That mix made the entire process uncomfortable, even when no one fired a shot. A family compound was not merely a building. It was an extension of family honour, privacy and social order. This made every intrusion risky beyond the immediate tactical danger. Coalition forces learned that disrespect toward Afghan homes, women, religious sites, and local customs could be exploited by insurgent messaging and could undermine efforts to gain cooperation from the population. NATO's tactical directive specifically linked respect for Afghan people, culture, and religion to military conduct. Counterinsurgency field guidance likewise warned that violating cultural taboos could feed adversary propaganda. That meant the soldier at the doorway was not simply managing a security problem, he was also stepping into a political problem, even if he had slept only 4 hours and was mostly thinking about the hand he could not see behind the door. In some areas, Afghan security forces led house entries because they could reduce cultural friction and communicate more naturally with residents. Yet that did not remove coalition anxiety. It shifted its shape. American, British, Dutch, Canadian and other coalition soldiers still stood nearby, still supported the mission, still entered compounds in various circumstances, still carried the consequences if an operation went badly. The presence of Afghan partners could help, but it also introduced complications of coordination, trust, language, and differing training. If people moved too slowly, a suspect might escape. If they moved too quickly, the risk of misreading a room increased. If an argument broke out at the doorway, the patrol might be exposed in the lane while trying to resolve it. Every pause had a cost. Every rush had a cost. The fear intensified during night operations. Darkness sharpened the advantage of surprise, but also multiplied confusion. A patrol moving at night could reach a compound before its occupants understood what was happening. That might reduce the chance of an insurgent fleeing. It might also mean waking a family abruptly, dogs barking, children crying, men stumbling from sleep, women trying to gather themselves in a room suddenly filled with armed strangers and bright lights. Night raids and searches became a major source of Afghan anger during the war, which is one reason coalition policy placed growing emphasis on limiting harm, improving Afghan participation, and balancing military urgency against the cost of alienating civilians. The soldier on the ground may not have been thinking in those exact terms during an entry, but the pressure was there. A single house search was never only a house search. It became part of how the war was remembered by the people who lived there. There were times when the doorway concealed real danger. Fighters did use homes and compounds. Military accounts from Afghanistan describe insurgents firing from civilian structures, hiding among the population, and exploiting the hesitation they expected coalition troops to show around inhabited buildings. In one Marine counterinsurgency study, Taliban fighters were reported to use civilian compounds as firing positions, understanding that return fire carried political risk. The danger for soldiers then was not imaginary. It came from a real tactical problem. The very restraint needed to protect civilians could be used against them by enemies who did not accept the same limits. That did not mean every home was a trap. In fact, most were not. Many village interactions involved conversation rather than violence. Coalition patrols visited homes to collect information, engage leaders, support local projects, or simply maintain contact. Soldiers drank tea in Afghan homes. They sat cross-legged in guest rooms. They removed helmets when appropriate. They listened while elders spoke about roads, wells, disputes, employment, corruption, security, and grievances. Those moments mattered because war in Afghanistan was not fought only through raids. It was also fought through relationship building, however fragile and uneven that effort could be. The same compound that looked alarming on approach might become a place of conversation 20 minutes later. The same doorway that caused a soldier to tighten his grip on his weapon might open onto hospitality rather than gunfire. But the soldier could not know that in advance. That is where the fear lived. The stress of these encounters was not only about personal survival, it was also about responsibility toward everyone present. A young private might fear being shot. A squad leader might fear losing one of his soldiers. A platoon commander might fear making a call that escalated the situation unnecessarily. An interpreter might fear being recognised later by hostile neighbours. Afghan police might fear retaliation against their families. A resident inside the house might fear that refusing entry looked suspicious, while allowing entry invited humiliation or gossip. The doorway gathered many fears into one cramped space. No briefing slide could fully capture that. Some of the most painful errors in war come from ordinary human reactions misread under extraordinary pressure. A person reaches quickly toward a pocket. A family member runs from one room to another. A man tries to hold a door shut because he is afraid of soldiers entering where women are present. A soldier interprets resistance as threat. A second soldier sees the first react and reacts as well. In military operations, hesitation can be fatal, but speed can also be fatal. This is why the split-second decision became one of the fears soldiers carried home. Not only the fear of being wrong in the moment, but the fear of replaying the moment afterward and wondering whether another half-second would have changed everything. NATO and Allied forces spent years refining guidance intended to reduce civilian casualties and force more deliberate judgment in complex settings, precisely because the war had shown how quickly tactical incidents could produce lasting consequences. The public often sees photographs of soldiers moving through Afghan villages and assumes that what matters is the visible tension. The rifle angled down but ready, the helmets, the serious faces, the local residents watching from a doorway. What cannot be seen is the amount of interpretation taking place inside each person. The soldier is reading the village. The villagers are reading the soldier. The Afghan interpreter is reading both. The squad leader is reading everyone while also thinking about routes in and out, rooftop lines, possible IED placements, whether the visit is producing useful information, and whether the unit has stayed too long in one place. A doorway search sits within that wider field of calculation. It is never just the room. It is the room, the lane, the roof, the reaction of the crowd, the possibility of an ambush during the exit, and the knowledge that the patrol must eventually move on. The fear could grow even sharper when operations turned from searches to active fighting inside or near compounds. A gunshot from a wall, a burst from a rooftop, a grenade thrown from behind a partition, a fighter darting from one courtyard to another. In those moments, the village stopped being a place to understand and became a place to survive, but only temporarily. Once the shooting ended, soldiers still had to determine who had fired, who had been caught in the middle, what damage had been done, whether the family in the compound was connected to the attack or simply trapped inside it, and how the event would ripple through the area afterward. Military case studies from Afghanistan describe commanders worrying not only about direct threats, but also about how tactical actions could affect the broader campaign for local support. This burden changed the way some soldiers remembered danger. Loud firefights could be terrifying, but they were at least unmistakably combat. Doorways were quieter, and often worse. The door had not yet become anything. It might become nothing. It might become the most important second of the deployment. There is a kind of dread in approaching an unknown room that no amount of training fully removes, because training can teach procedures, but cannot tell you who is waiting inside this particular house on this particular morning. The soldier knows only that once he crosses the threshold, he inherits the room and every consequence that follows. And yet they crossed thresholds again and again. Not because they were reckless, because the mission required it. Weapons had to be found, suspects had to be detained, civilians had to be engaged, local leaders had to be met. Compounds reported as insurgent safe houses had to be checked. Villages could not be understood entirely from outside their walls. This is one of the hard realities of the Afghanistan war. To accomplish many of the tasks assigned to them, soldiers had to enter spaces where tactical, cultural, moral and emotional risks all converged at once. Over time, units developed habits to manage the tension. They relied on interpreters. They learned which local gestures mattered. They used Afghan partners when policy and circumstances allowed. They became more deliberate in how they approached doors and courtyards. They tried to separate family members calmly. They tried to search without destroying. They listened for the tone of a household as much as for words. None of this guaranteed safety. It simply made the work less blind. In a war defined by uncertainty, even modest reductions in uncertainty mattered. The memory of these scenes often stayed with soldiers because they were so close to ordinary life. A roadside bomb could be remembered as a blast, a crater, a vehicle. A village entry carried faces, a father at the door, a child watching from behind a curtain, a woman's cry from another room, an old man trying to explain that no one in the family had seen anything. A soldier knows that war has entered a home because he brought it across the threshold, even if he believed the entry was necessary. That knowledge is difficult to carry. It does not fit neatly into slogans about bravery or mission accomplishment. It remains more complicated than that. The village, the doorway, and the split-second decision formed one of the central fears of the Afghanistan war because they forced soldiers to confront the thing many modern armies fear most in counterinsurgency. Not merely being attacked, but being made to decide under pressure in a place where mistakes harm the people one is supposed to protect. The danger was real. The restraint was real. The uncertainty was real. And because all three existed together, a simple doorway could feel heavier than a battlefield stretching to the horizon. After enough time in that environment, fear did not always come from the stranger beyond the wall. Sometimes it began to creep closer. It entered briefings, training missions, shared bases, joint patrols, and the uneasy knowledge that danger might come from someone wearing a uniform meant to signal partnership. The next fear did not wait behind a village door. It stood nearby, spoke the language of cooperation, and carried a weapon within reach. There is a kind of fear in war that begins outside you. The roadside bomb, the distant gunman, the figure moving along a ridge. Those threats are terrible, but at least they seem to belong to the obvious category of danger. They come from the enemy, from beyond the perimeter, from the side of the world you have already been warned to watch. Afghanistan had plenty of that. Soldiers learned to distrust roads, compounds, rooftops, culverts, and silence. They learned that danger could be hidden, patient, and close. But as the war continued, another fear entered the story, and for many troops it felt more unsettling than a distant ambush, because it attacked something soldiers depended on every day. Trust. By the early 2010s, coalition troops in Afghanistan were working closely with Afghan soldiers and police as part of the larger strategy to build security forces capable of taking over the fight. They trained together, patrolled together, planned together, stood guard on the same bases, met in the same rooms, and shared the practical routines of a war that had already lasted far longer than many people had expected. The entire direction of the mission increasingly depended on partnership. Foreign troops were not meant to fight forever. Afghan forces were meant to lead. That meant proximity. It meant cooperation. It meant being beside armed men who were supposed to be allies. And that is why the rise of insider attacks, often called green-on-blue attacks when Afghan security personnel turned their weapons on coalition troops, struck at the centre of the war's logic. This fear did not arrive all at once. It built gradually, attack by attack, rumour by rumour, briefing by briefing. A shooting at a training facility, a coalition soldier killed during a meeting, advisors attacked by someone wearing the uniform of an Afghan partner, a policeman opening fire during what should have been ordinary coordination. Each incident was specific, but together they changed the emotional texture of partnership. In March 2012, the commander of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan publicly acknowledged that Afghan and coalition leaders were changing operations to address insider killings. By that point, 15 coalition members had already been killed in such incidents that year, and measures were being introduced to alter sleeping arrangements, guard routines, vetting, and deployment training. It is difficult to imagine how corrosive this became unless you place yourself inside the daily routine. A soldier assigned to train Afghan forces could not simply avoid them. That was the mission. He might spend mornings on a firing range, afternoons discussing maintenance, evenings reviewing patrol planning. He might sit across from the same Afghan officer day after day, gradually learning his habits, his sense of humour, the cadence of his speech through an interpreter. He might begin to feel something resembling professional affection, the kind that grows when people have shared discomfort, heat, bureaucracy, and danger. Then a report comes over the radio that elsewhere in the country, a coalition advisor has been shot by the man beside him. The next day the routine resumes, but not exactly. The room looks slightly different. Weapons look slightly different. The man entering late looks slightly different. No one wants suspicion to take over, yet no one can pretend the possibility does not exist. That was the emotional cruelty of the insider threat. It punished closeness. It made normal partnership feel like exposure. A soldier had to continue offering trust in order to accomplish the mission, while also accepting that trust had become a vulnerability. It is one thing to enter a village knowing the enemy might be hidden among strangers. It is another to enter a briefing room knowing the danger might come from someone whose name you know, someone you have stood beside during previous missions, someone whose weapon does not attract attention because he is supposed to be armed. That difference matters. The fear was not simply death, it was betrayal at arm's length. By January 2013, NATO personnel were describing insider attacks as the #1 strategic risk in Afghanistan. An army report from that period stated that since ISAF began officially tracking these attacks in May 2007, 126 coalition personnel had been killed, including 62 in 2012 alone, the worst year for such incidents. Afghan soldiers and police were also being killed in insider attacks, which coalition officials emphasised repeatedly because this was not a problem experienced only by foreign troops. It was an Afghan problem as well, often called green on green, when Afghan personnel attacked other Afghan forces. The fear moved through both sides of the partnership. There is a temptation to explain all of this with a single cause, because a single cause is easier to hold in the mind. Taliban infiltration, religious extremism, cultural misunderstanding, personal grievance, poor vetting, revenge. Each of these played a role in some cases, but official statements at the time resisted turning insider attacks into one clean category. General John Allen said in 2012 that while the Taliban claimed credit for such attacks and did attempt infiltration, the majority were not directly the result of Taliban infiltration. A senior CENTCOM enlisted leader that same year argued that many incidents arose from cultural and religious friction, while a smaller portion reflected deliberate enemy penetration. These explanations were assessments, not mathematical certainties, but they show why the threat was so hard to solve. You cannot defeat a problem easily when it may come from ideological infiltration in one case, wounded pride in another, personal anger in a third, and enemy manipulation in a fourth. For the soldier living through it, the cause mattered, but the immediate experience was simpler and harsher. You watched behaviour, you remembered training, you stayed courteous. You tried not to insult anyone unintentionally. You noticed if someone seemed agitated, unusually withdrawn, or out of place. You listened when interpreters flagged tension. You learned that small social gestures could carry more weight than you expected. Coalition leaders increasingly stressed cultural awareness, not as a polite side topic, but as a force protection issue. Respecting local customs, understanding Afghan partners, and avoiding needless friction became part of staying alive. That did not mean every attack could be prevented through better manners. It meant soldiers were being told that the line between partnership and danger could sometimes be shaped by interactions that seemed minor in the moment. This is one of the most uncomfortable facts about Afghanistan. A war can train people to be alert to bombs, wires, and sniper positions. It can issue armour, sensors, and reinforced vehicles, But how does one armour a relationship? How does a unit maintain enough trust to work beside Afghan partners, while also preparing for the chance that one of them might turn suddenly? The answer developed in practical ways. Vetting improved. Afghan leaders added screening processes and counterintelligence personnel within recruitment and training structures. Coalition units altered living arrangements and security procedures. The Guardian Angel program was introduced, assigning at least one person during partner activities to remain focused on force protection and ready to react if an insider attack began. The idea was brutally direct. Even during meetings, training, or cooperative operations, someone would watch the room. There is something sad in that image. A group of men working together on a shared mission, while one of them has the specific task of quietly considering whether the partnership might become lethal. It was not paranoia in the childish sense, it was policy born from blood. Army descriptions of Guardian Angels make clear that the role existed to deter and respond to insider attacks, while coalition troops interacted with Afghan forces. By 2019, Army training materials still describe the program as having been created in 2012 specifically to counter green-on-blue attacks, evidence of how deeply the insider threat altered the advisory mission. Picture a meeting at a small base. The room is cramped. Afghan officers sit along one side, coalition advisors along another. Maps may be spread out. Tea may be served. An interpreter works between the groups, converting technical discussion into shared understanding. They speak about security checkpoints, patrol routes, shortages of ammunition, delayed pay, or the condition of a vehicle fleet. It is not dramatic. In many ways, this is the kind of mundane coordination on which entire campaigns depend. And yet one soldier is standing near the edge of the room, not fully engaged in the discussion, because his role is to watch hands, posture, doorways, weapons. He must notice the shift before the shooting begins. He must move first if movement becomes necessary. Everyone knows why he is there, even if no one says it aloud. That silence alone changes the room. The insider threat also distorted the meaning of rest. On many bases, foreign and Afghan forces shared space, worked side by side and crossed paths during ordinary routines. Before insider attacks became a major concern, a dining facility, a work area, or a training compound might have felt safer simply because it was inside the wire. The growth of green-on-blue attacks complicated that distinction. Danger no longer belonged exclusively to patrol routes and contested villages. It might enter from within the secure area wearing a uniform. When commanders changed sleeping, basing and guard arrangements in 2012, they were acknowledging that security had become more intimate. The threat could come from someone not breaking into the base, but already permitted to be there. That shift can be hard for civilians to grasp because we tend to think of trust as optional. In military units, trust is operational. Soldiers trust that the person on the left will cover one sector, that the medic will respond, that the interpreter is carrying meaning accurately, that the partner force will hold its side of a perimeter. Once trust becomes conditional in every direction, mental strain multiplies. Soldiers may still act professionally. Many did. They may still build real friendships with Afghan counterparts. Many did. But the existence of insider attacks inserted a constant low-level question into spaces that had previously offered a measure of relief. Is this person safe? That question did not have to be asked aloud to have an effect. There was also a strategic fear behind the personal one. If coalition troops began distrusting Afghan forces broadly, the transition mission itself could suffer. Advising required proximity, training required repetition, joint operations required coordination. NATO officials understood that insider attacks were not only designed to kill individuals, they had the potential to damage the relationship between the coalition and the very forces the coalition was trying to strengthen. CENTCOM statements in 2012 stressed that the threat must not be allowed to fracture the partnership. The concern was obvious. If suspicion widened too far, every interaction could slow down. Every joint patrol could become more guarded. Every training event could shrink. The Taliban did not need to destroy an army in order to weaken the mission. They could also damage confidence between allies. The fear remained even as the war changed. By 2018, with the US role focused more heavily on advising Afghan forces and conducting counter-terrorism operations, official Defense Department reporting still described insider attacks as an active concern. During one reporting period that year, there were 4 insider attacks against US personnel, while Afghan forces experienced 34 insider attacks against their own ranks. The same report noted enhanced screening measures, the removal of 199 Afghan Special Security Forces personnel during that period, and the continued effort to formalise insider threat policy across Afghan institutions. These details show that the problem did not belong only to the peak years of 2012 and 2013. It persisted because partnership remained central and because armed institutions under war pressure are vulnerable to infiltration, grievance, coercion, and fracture. By 2020, even as the war moved through negotiations, drawdown plans, and reduced attacks on US troops under the agreement with the Taliban, insider violence against Afghan forces still appeared in official reporting. One lead inspector general overview noted 21 insider attacks against Afghan security forces during a reporting period in 2020. The coalition footprint was changing, but the deeper problem of trust inside armed Afghan institutions had not simply vanished. For soldiers, the most painful aspect of insider attacks may have been that they threatened to contaminate good relationships with fear. Many coalition troops served alongside Afghan soldiers and police they respected deeply. Some developed enduring bonds with interpreters, officers, patrol partners, and local commanders. They saw Afghan personnel fight bravely, suffer casualties, return to duty, and face dangers foreign troops could not easily leave behind because Afghanistan was their home. Official military statements repeatedly emphasised that insider attacks affected Afghan forces too, and that most coalition Afghan relationships remained strong. That mattered because the public narrative can flatten partnership into suspicion when the reality was much more complex. The fear was real precisely because cooperation was real. Betrayal only hurts where trust existed first. There is also something deeply exhausting about being asked to maintain warmth and vigilance at the same time. Advisors could not perform their work while radiating contempt or fear toward every Afghan counterpart. That would poison the mission instantly. So many soldiers learn to live in a narrow corridor between openness and self-protection. Shake hands, sit down, listen carefully, share information, smile when appropriate, notice the exit, notice who entered late, notice who seems distracted, notice whether a rifle is slung differently today, continue the conversation, continue the partnership. Continue pretending that the extra layer of attention is simply part of routine. Over time, routine can make almost anything look normal from the outside. The attacks themselves were often brief and devastating. A burst of gunfire in a room, shots during training, a weapon raised at close range. The violence could unfold before people had time to understand that the scene had changed. This separated insider attacks from many other battlefield threats. A mortar gave warning through sound. A firefight often revealed itself through distance and direction. An insider attack could begin inside the ordinary posture of cooperation. The first seconds were not spent closing with an enemy. They were spent realizing that an ally had become one. That mental transition can cost time, and in close quarters, violence time is life. The impact afterward spread far beyond those directly hit. Units revisited procedures. People replayed the lead-up. Was there a warning? Was he quieter than usual? Did anyone notice agitation? Could the weapon have been positioned differently? Should the meeting have been arranged another way? These questions rarely produce satisfying answers. Sometimes there were signs, sometimes there were none. Sometimes the attack was later linked to infiltration. Sometimes it appeared tied to grievance or dispute. In each case, soldiers were left with the same ugly lesson. Proximity does not guarantee safety, and the human face across from you may reveal less than you need it to. And still, many soldiers would say that abandoning trust completely was impossible. The mission demanded more than suspicion. It demanded patience. It demanded the ability to distinguish a genuine partner from a potential threat without allowing fear to erase the distinction altogether. That was not only a tactical challenge, it was an emotional one. Soldiers who served as advisors or trainers had to decide each day that cooperation remained possible, even after the war had shown them how badly it could go. In some ways, that required a different kind of courage than moving down a dangerous road. A road cannot smile at you. A road cannot drink tea with you. A road cannot discuss next week's patrol and then, in another district, someone wearing a similar uniform opens fire on another team. The human part made it harder. What soldiers feared most during those years was not always the certainty of hostility. Sometimes it was the uncertainty of loyalty. The roadside bomb attacked confidence in the ground. The hidden gunman attacked confidence in the landscape. The insider threat attacked confidence in the person beside you. That is why it lodged so deeply in memory. It forced troops to carry suspicion into spaces where trust had been the whole point. Training compounds, planning rooms, shared bases, joint patrols. Even moments of apparent calm could hold a quiet second meaning. And when the fear became real, when shots were fired from within a partnered space, everything narrowed quickly. Someone fell. Someone returned fire. Someone shouted for a medic. Someone called over the radio. The threat might be over in seconds, but the next fear arrived immediately after it. Whether help could reach the wounded fast enough, whether a helicopter could lift through dust, heat, terrain and danger, and whether the person bleeding nearby would still be alive when it did. The first fear after the blast was not always pain. Sometimes pain came later. Sometimes shock held it back for a few seconds. The first fear was often time. How much had just been lost? How much was left? Was the bleeding controllable? Was the airway open? Was the casualty conscious? Was the medevac bird already being called? Could it reach them? Could it land? Would it be forced away by fire? In Afghanistan, the helicopter was not merely transportation. To wounded soldiers, and to the people trying to keep them alive, it could feel like the thin moving line between survival and everything else. A patrol could spend hours moving carefully through a valley, checking roads, scanning compounds, watching ridge lines, and then everything might narrow into a single frantic minute. An explosion, gunfire, someone down, a medic running low and fast, a squad leader shouting for a 9-line medical evacuation request. Tourniquets pulled tight, a radio operator trying to speak clearly while kneeling in dust beside a wounded friend. Coordinates had to be transmitted, the number of casualties, the kind of injuries, whether the landing zone was secure, whether enemy fire was present, whether the patient required urgent evacuation. Every detail mattered because a helicopter crew somewhere else would begin building the rescue in their minds before the aircraft ever lifted off. Military medical guidance and training in Afghanistan made the 9-line request a central bridge between the point of injury and aerial evacuation. The soldiers on the ground understood, even if they did not say it, that once a medevac call went out, 2 clocks began running at the same time. One belonged to the wounded body: blood loss, breathing, shock, head injury, burns, internal trauma that no one could fully see in the dirt beside a road. The other belonged to the helicopter. How quickly could it launch? How far away was it? Would the route pass over hostile terrain? Was the weather acceptable? Could the aircraft approach the landing zone without exposing itself to too much risk? In 2009, US defense leadership pushed the golden hour standard in Afghanistan, aiming to get seriously wounded personnel to surgical care within 60 minutes when feasible, and later military medical reviews credited faster evacuation with saving lives. That policy mattered because Afghanistan was not a compact battlefield. Distances were deceptive. Two locations might look close on a map and still be separated by mountains, poor roads, hostile valleys, altitude, or weather. A casualty at a remote outpost could not simply be driven to a large hospital in a few minutes. Ground movement might take hours. In some places it might be impossible during a fight. This is why helicopters became so emotionally important. They could cross terrain that trapped everyone else. They could reach a small landing zone carved into a valley or an outpost wedged against a mountainside. They could take a soldier who had been critically wounded in a place that felt cut off from the world and move him toward operating rooms, blood banks, surgeons, and a larger chain of care stretching eventually to Bagram, Kandahar, Landstuhl in Germany, or beyond. For the wounded, the sound of rotors could become one of the most hopeful sounds in the war. It began faintly, nearly swallowed by gunfire, radios, or wind. Then it grew, thump, 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 coming closer. Soldiers who had spent the last 10 minutes holding pressure on a wound or counting respirations might look up despite themselves. There it was, somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the dust, beyond the ridgeline. A Black Hawk, a Pave Hawk, a medical bird, a crew coming toward a place everyone else wished they could leave. Army and Air Force accounts from Afghanistan repeatedly describe medevac and rescue crews remaining on alert around the clock, launching to retrieve wounded service members, Afghan partners, and civilians. But hope did not erase fear. The helicopter still had to arrive. An arrival could be one of the most dangerous moments of all. A landing zone in Afghanistan was not always a clean circle marked neatly in open ground. It might be a rough patch beside a wall. It might be a field cut by irrigation ditches. It might be a stretch of road with debris pushed aside. It might be a ridgeline shelf, a courtyard, or a slope where the aircraft could barely settle. The downwash from the rotors could turn loose soil into a blinding storm, producing what pilots called dust landings or brownout conditions. Visibility could collapse almost entirely just when precision mattered most. National Guard and Air Force reports from Afghanistan described these dust conditions as a major challenge for helicopter crews, especially during medevac and rescue operations. Imagine being on the ground as one came in. The casualty had already been moved if possible. Security was posted. Everyone knew the landing had to be fast. The helicopter descended and the world disappeared into grit. Dust slammed against goggles, teeth, lips, weapon stocks, open wounds, everything. Soldiers crouched, turning their faces away while still trying to hold litters steady. The helicopter seemed enormous at that distance, loud enough to erase thought. You could feel the blades in your chest. The crew chief might be leaning from the door, searching through the brown cloud for hand signals, obstacles, wires, walls, people, anything that could turn the rescue into another emergency. If the aircraft drifted just a few feet too far in a cramped space, the rotor system, tail, or landing gear could strike something unforgiving. Real incidents in Afghanistan showed how narrow the margin could be. In a 2016 response in Marja, one medical evacuation helicopter was waved off after taking fire, while another landed but sustained rotor damage after apparently striking a wall, and there was enemy fire. It is important to say this carefully. The US Army stated in 2012 that it had no evidence insurgents deliberately targeted medical evacuation helicopters, specifically because they were medevac aircraft. But the same statement also made clear that hostile forces tried to shoot down US and coalition aircraft generally, and medevac helicopters could be fired on during rescue attempts. Afghanistan produced multiple documented cases of crews completing evacuations while under direct attack. In 2010, an Army report described a medevac Black Hawk taking 2 direct hits while hovering to hoist casualties from an ambush site. In 2019, soldiers were recognized for valor after continuing an aeromedical evacuation mission despite hostile fire. This is where the fear deepened for the troops waiting below. A helicopter arriving under fire was not simply help. It was help being endangered on their behalf. Soldiers knew the crew had chosen to come into the same threat area that had just wounded someone on the ground. If the aircraft was forced away, the casualty remained with them. If it stayed too long, it could be hit. If it was hit badly enough, there might be more wounded, more dead, and another rescue problem layered over the first. The people holding the litter were not thinking in military abstractions. They were thinking, get him on, get her on, move, move, move. Every second near the aircraft was a second everyone felt. The helicopter crews carried their own version of that fear. They trained for it. They rehearsed it. They understood the mission demanded speed, technical precision, and composure under terrible conditions, but no amount of training turns danger into nothing. A pilot descending into a hot landing zone had to fly the aircraft, judge the terrain, coordinate with the crew, absorb radio updates, and sometimes make decisions while enemy fire was still active. A flight medic inside the aircraft might be preparing to receive a patient whose injuries were unknown or only partially described. A crew chief might be watching the ground, guiding the aircraft, scanning for obstacles, and then helping move casualties once they came aboard. Rescue units in Afghanistan conducted missions by day and night, including emergency pickups from hostile areas and remote outposts. There are accounts from Afghanistan that make the danger painfully vivid. In one 2010 mission, a medevac crew moved into an ambush area to recover wounded personnel, adjusting plans as the situation changed and completing the hoist while taking fire. In another rescue operation described by the Air Force, an HH-60G crew used a one-wheel hover on a mountainside during a dangerous recovery, getting survivors aboard in roughly 10 seconds before lifting away under enemy fire. These are dramatic examples, certainly, but they reveal the kinds of conditions that shape the fear surrounding medical evacuation. The helicopter was hope, but hope was not invulnerable. The phrase "under fire" can sound almost routine when repeated often enough in military writing. It should not. Under fire means rounds striking near the aircraft or near the landing zone. It means the crew may not know exactly where all the threats are. It means a wounded person may be lying in open ground because there was no better place to wait. It means soldiers loading the litter may have to expose themselves briefly to get the casualty inside. It means the pilot may need to remain in a vulnerable hover for longer than anyone wants because the patient cannot simply walk aboard. A 2014 Army medical article noted that point-of-injury medevac flights could involve very brief, intense interventions, sometimes under enemy fire, before the patient was moved toward higher care. For the injured soldier, those minutes were often fragmented. He might remember the medic's face and nothing afterward. He might remember the helicopter ceiling. He might remember being cold despite the heat. He might remember someone cutting his uniform away. He might remember shouting that he could not feel his legs, or insisting he was fine while everyone around him knew he was not. Inside the aircraft, the fight changed form. The enemy was no longer a shooter or an explosive. It was blood loss, airway compromise, shock, time. Air medical teams, flight medics, para-rescue men and critical care transport personnel worked inside cramped aircraft with limited space and violent noise, stabilizing patients while the pilots pushed toward treatment facilities. The sophistication of that medical chain is one of the less discussed histories of the Afghanistan war. Combat casualty care improved significantly during the post-9/11 wars, with faster evacuation, better trauma systems, stronger battlefield medicine, and coordinated movement from point of injury to surgical care and then onward through aeromedical evacuation. Army medical assessments and later reviews emphasised that not every critically wounded patient could be saved, and that many combat deaths still occurred before hospital arrival, but faster movement and improved trauma care clearly mattered. That reality shaped how soldiers viewed the helicopter. It was not a vague symbol of rescue. It was a component of a system they had seen work. They had watched wounded friends leave the battlefield alive because of it. This knowledge could be comforting. It could also make delay terrifying. Once troops believed a fast medevac might save someone, every obstacle to that medevac became emotionally sharper. Weather. dust, terrain, enemy fire, a landing zone that was too dangerous, a radio transmission that had to be repeated, a casualty whose position changed after the call, a helicopter that was already supporting another emergency somewhere else. In a 2016 Defense Department briefing, officials described the golden hour standard in Afghanistan as 1 hour from the medevac call to arrival at a medical care facility, showing how tightly time had been built into expectations. When people know that minutes matter, silence on the radio can feel endless. There were also missions where evacuation could not happen immediately. Early in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, medical reviews noted that delays of hours, and in some settings even longer, were seen in austere environments, which drove planning for alternative evacuation methods and prolonged field care. Afghanistan's geography, especially in remote districts, made that possibility impossible to dismiss completely even after systems improved. Soldiers knew that the preferred chain of care depended on conditions that could break. The helicopter might be on the way, or it might not be able to come yet. A unit might need to hold the casualty longer than planned. That thought carried a fear all its own. The medical crews did not only evacuate US personnel. Throughout the war, they moved coalition troops, Afghan security forces, and local civilians when circumstances required it. Air Force and Army accounts describe rescue and medevac units transporting wounded Afghans and local nationals as part of their missions. This mattered at a human level and at a political one. A helicopter landing for an Afghan child injured by violence, or for an Afghan soldier wounded while fighting beside coalition troops, could become one of the few visible moments in the war when military power arrived only to preserve life. It did not erase the larger conflict. But those moments were real, and those who saw them tended to remember them. Still, for soldiers in combat, the emotional centre remained intensely personal. The medevac bird meant someone they knew might live. That is why the sound of rotors could trigger relief so immediate it bordered on physical weakness. A squad might remain disciplined on the outside, holding security, speaking in short phrases, moving litters with care. Inside, some were silently bargaining with time. Just land, just get here, just take him. The helicopter represented a promise the war could not always keep, but tried desperately to honour, that if you were wounded, your people would come for you. US rescue and medevac units built their reputations around that promise, and stories of crews entering dangerous areas to retrieve casualties became part of the moral memory of the war. That promise shaped behaviour long before any casualty occurred. Soldiers went on missions knowing there was a medical evacuation system behind them, and that knowledge supported courage in ways difficult to measure. It did not make them careless. It did not reduce fear to nothing. But it changed what was bearable. The possibility of fast extraction allowed commanders to plan differently, and troops to operate in places that otherwise would have felt even more isolated. When the system worked, it tightened the bond between frontline soldiers, medics, pilots, and hospital teams who might never meet before that day and might never meet again afterward. Yet soldiers feared the moment when that promise would be tested because they understood its stakes. They feared hearing the medic call for more gauze. They feared the radio message that the landing zone was not secure. They feared the phrase, "bird waved off." They feared seeing the helicopter circle but not land. They feared watching a casualty fade while the engine noise remained distant. They feared, too, what happened if the helicopter came in and took fire, because then gratitude and guilt twisted together. Someone had entered danger to reach them. Someone might not make it home because of that decision. These emotions rarely fit into official after-action reports, but they existed in the pause after evacuation, when the aircraft lifted away and the remaining soldiers were left in dust, noise fading, mission unfinished. The departure could feel as intense as the arrival. The helicopter rose, often quickly, turning toward the nearest medical facility. The ground team watched only briefly before snapping back to the present. There might still be enemy nearby. There might be a second casualty. The patrol might have to move. The wounded person had been handed off, but nothing was resolved yet. In the aircraft, medics kept working. At the receiving facility, surgical teams prepared. The wounded soldier was now travelling through a system built from radios, fuel, training, blood, rotor blades, and people refusing to let distance decide the outcome alone. Afghanistan's medical evacuation chain became one of the most significant operational achievements of the conflict, even as its very necessity revealed how often soldiers were being grievously wounded. For those who remained behind, however, there was no certainty yet. A medevac departure did not automatically mean survival. The soldier on the ground might not learn the outcome for hours. Maybe someone eventually said he was stable. Maybe someone said surgery was underway. Maybe someone became quiet before answering. Those gaps became part of the fear, too. The helicopter had done what it could. Now the waiting returned. Waiting for news. Waiting for the next mission. Waiting for the next call no one wanted to make. That is why the helicopter coming in under fire occupied such a powerful place in the memory of the Afghanistan war. It gathered so many fears into a single moving image. The fear of being wounded far from care. The fear of losing someone before help arrived. The fear of a rescue attempt failing. The fear of watching brave people risk themselves to retrieve the already hurt. And beneath all of it, the fear that even when the medevac worked exactly as intended, the person lifted away might still not return. That fear did not end when the rotors disappeared. It followed the unit back to the outpost, into the medical tent, into the empty bunk, and into the next patrol where everyone understood a little more clearly how quickly a name could become a casualty report. The helicopter could arrive quickly. The surgical team could be waiting. The medical system could be better than anything soldiers in earlier wars had ever known. And still, there was one part of the rescue no machine could shorten. The first minute. The first hands on the wound. The first person who realised someone was bleeding badly. The first voice shouting for a medic while also trying to understand whether the shooting had stopped. In Afghanistan, one of the deepest fears soldiers carried was not simply that they might be killed. It was that someone beside them might be dying while they were still trying to save him, and that the difference between life and death might depend on what they did before help had fully arrived. This fear lived close to every patrol because the injuries of the war could be sudden and catastrophic. A buried explosive could tear through a vehicle or erupt beneath a foot patrol. Gunfire could strike a neck, a chest, or an artery in the leg. Shrapnel could enter places no armour fully covered. A soldier who had been speaking normally seconds before might be on the ground, silent or confused, with everyone around him trying to turn shock into action. The people nearby did not always have time to feel fear in a clear way at first. They moved, they took cover, they returned fire if needed. They dragged the casualty behind a wall into a ditch beside a vehicle, anywhere that offered even a little protection. Then they looked down and saw the truth of the moment. Someone they knew was hurt badly, and now the war had become intimate. Military medicine during the Afghanistan war improved dramatically, and that improvement saved lives. Tactical combat casualty care, developed in the 1990s and expanded across the force during the post-9/11 wars, pushed life-saving skills closer to the point of injury instead of waiting for a hospital to do everything. The focus became brutally practical. Stop severe bleeding, open or protect the airway, treat life-threatening chest injuries, prevent shock and move the casualty toward evacuation. A 2013 Joint Trauma System assessment of Afghanistan noted that after the widespread fielding of modern tourniquets and aggressive training in their use, deaths from extremity hemorrhage among US combat fatalities fell substantially compared with the earlier conflicts and the early years of Afghanistan and Iraq. This is one of the most important medical changes of the war, and soldiers understood its meaning in simple terms. The person nearest the wound might matter as much as the doctor waiting later. That knowledge brought comfort, but it also brought pressure. Once soldiers had been trained to save lives, they feared failing to do it. In older wars, a person might feel helpless because there was little anyone could do. In Afghanistan, there was often something to do, and doing it correctly mattered. Place the tourniquet high and tight when needed. Tighten it enough. Check whether the bleeding has stopped. Pack the wound if pressure is required. Roll the casualty carefully if the situation allows. Watch the breathing. Watch consciousness. Call for the medic. Keep talking to the wounded if he can hear you. Keep working if he cannot answer. Training gave soldiers tools. It did not remove the fear that, under real conditions, with dust in the air and shouting all around, their hands might shake or their mind might briefly go blank. The Army's combat lifesaver training existed for precisely this reason. Not every casualty would be reached first by a medic. Sometimes the nearest person was another infantryman, a vehicle crew member, an engineer, a military police officer, or a young soldier who had expected to spend the day scanning the road and suddenly found himself pressing both hands into a wound. Army reports from the war described combat lifesaver courses teaching non-medical troops to address the major preventable causes of battlefield death, especially severe bleeding, airway blockage, and chest injuries. The idea was simple and serious. There had to be more than one kind of lifesaver in a unit. The medic might be 30 metres away. The casualty might not have 30 seconds to spare. Picture what that looked like after an IED strike. The sound had already passed, but the world still felt as if it were vibrating. Someone was yelling over the radio. Someone else was checking for a second device. A vehicle might be torn open, tipped, or smoking. A soldier crawled toward a friend who had been thrown into the dirt. He called his name once, then again, louder. Maybe the friend answered. Maybe he did not. There was blood on the ground, but in combat it was not always easy to tell immediately where it was coming from. Uniforms were darkened by dust. Gear covered parts of the body. The rescuer had to think while his own body was full of adrenaline. Is the leg bleeding? Is it the arm? Is there another wound under the armour? Is the breathing normal? Where is the medic? This was the moment soldiers feared because it was not theoretical anymore. Every training lane, every rubber tourniquet pulled tight around a partner's arm in practice, every instructor's warning about speed and pressure had arrived at once in the worst possible setting. A great deal of the history of battlefield medicine is hidden in these early moments, because the hospital receives the patient only if enough has gone right beforehand. The Joint Trauma Systems Afghanistan Review found that among US combat fatalities in Afghanistan and Iraq from 2001 to 2011, the overwhelming majority died before reaching a medical treatment facility, and military medical experts judged that roughly 1 in 4 of those pre-hospital deaths had been potentially preventable. That finding shaped enormous changes in training and equipment. It also explains why soldiers feared losing someone before they could save them. They knew, sometimes from classes and sometimes from experience, that survival often depended on the minutes before the helicopter, before surgery, before the official medical record began. Hemorrhage was especially terrifying because it was both visible and fast. Bleeding out is not a vague battlefield danger. It is a race a person can watch with his own eyes. A soldier can see colour draining from a friend's face. He can hear the voice getting weaker. He can feel warmth on gloves or hands. He can know that the body is losing what it cannot easily replace. That is why the renewed emphasis on tourniquets became so important during the war. Army medical reporting later credited tourniquet use, transfusion advances, and improved prevention of hypothermia as key innovations in saving trauma patients. But on the ground, the lesson came down to something brutally direct. If an artery was open, someone had to close the problem immediately, not after a better-equipped person arrived. There was a particular fear when the wound was not easy to control. A tourniquet could save someone with severe extremity bleeding, but injuries to the pelvis, groin, neck, or torso were harder. The Joint Trauma System identified surgically correctable torso hemorrhage, junctional hemorrhage, airway compromise, and tension pneumothorax as major remaining causes of potentially preventable battlefield death. soldiers and medics in Afghanistan learned that not every life-saving problem could be solved fully in the dirt. Some could only be slowed, some required blood, some required surgery quickly. This created a special kind of helplessness. A soldier might be doing everything correctly and still feel the casualty slipping away because the injury demanded more than the ground could provide. The medic carried this fear in a concentrated form. Combat medics were not distant support figures. They moved with patrols, rode in convoys, entered firefights, and ran toward injured people while others were still seeking cover. Army reporting during the war noted that medic training had been reshaped around battlefield realities, with the Army emphasising that medics needed to be prepared for immediate life-saving action in combat rather than primarily hospital work. That description matters because the medic was often the person everyone looked toward when the scene became worst. Soldiers could perform first aid, and many did so with skill, but when the medic arrived, the emotional temperature changed. Someone had come who was supposed to know what to do next. That expectation could be a comfort for the unit and a burden for the medic. Medics feared arriving too late. They feared reaching a casualty who had already lost too much blood. They feared finding one critically wounded soldier, then hearing that there were two more. They feared the moment when they had to decide who needed attention first, because time and hands were limited. They feared the casualty who was conscious enough to look at them and ask whether he was going to be all right. There are no perfect answers in those moments. Sometimes medics spoke with calm certainty because calm itself had value. Sometimes they avoided promises and simply kept working. Apply pressure. Open the airway. Insert the needle if the chest injury demands it. Start the evacuation process. Tell the casualty to stay with you. Tell him again. The history of the war is full of weapon systems, troop levels and campaign plans, but for many soldiers, memory of Afghanistan narrowed into scenes like this: one injured person and several others refusing to stop trying. The fear was not limited to American soldiers. Afghan soldiers, police and civilians were wounded in the same war, often in settings where their medical systems were thinner and evacuation less dependable. US medics trained Afghan security forces in bleeding control, casualty movement, and life-saving field procedures because partner forces faced heavy casualties and needed to sustain themselves when coalition assistance was not immediately present. Army reports from 2012 and 2013 describe Afghan troops learning tourniquet use, wound packing, and tactical casualty movement from US medical personnel. That history matters because the fear of losing someone before help came was not confined to coalition patrols. It was built into the experience of Afghan forces across the war. There is something especially difficult about trying to save a person while danger remains active. Civilian first aid usually imagines the threat has passed. Combat medicine begins from a harder assumption. The enemy may still be firing. The ground may hold another device. The casualty may be in an exposed location. A rescuer may need to suppress a threat, move the wounded, and then begin treatment. Tactical combat casualty care was designed around these realities, recognizing that life-saving action had to fit the battlefield rather than ignore it. In practical terms, this meant a soldier sometimes had to wait seconds that felt unforgivable before reaching a friend because rushing into the open could create 2 casualties instead of 1. This was another fear soldiers carried. The fear of seeing someone injured and not being able to reach him immediately without making the situation worse. That delay, even when tactically necessary, could be hard to live with afterward. A soldier might know intellectually that he had obeyed training. He might know that moving too soon under fire would have endangered the whole team. Still, memory does not always obey logic. Memory returns to the sight of a friend lying in the open. It returns to the voice asking for help. It returns to the seconds before movement became possible. Those seconds can stretch for years in the mind. The fear during the event was immediate. The guilt afterward could be much slower and more stubborn. Military medicine can calculate survival rates. It cannot fully measure the emotional burden of having watched the clock run while waiting for a safe chance to move. When soldiers did reach a wounded friend, they often worked in teams. One maintained security, one called the medevac, one began treatment, one prepared the litter, one searched for additional injuries. In training, these roles could seem orderly. In combat, they were often messy but still recognisable. The point was to turn panic into sequence. The Army's trauma care reforms and repeated emphasis on casualty response reflected a hard-earned understanding. Lives were saved not by heroism alone, but by practice systems carried out under pressure. A 2024 Military Review article looking back on lessons from the 75th Ranger Regiment emphasised how tactical medical planning, rehearsals, and unit-wide casualty response systems streamlined treatment and evacuation. That principle had become visible throughout the Afghanistan war. The best units did not wait for bravery to improvise everything. They rehearsed what bravery would need to do. Still, rehearsals never made the real body less real. In practice, the casualty might be a mannequin, a volunteer, or a soldier pretending to groan while others work through steps. In Afghanistan, it was a friend with dust in his eyelashes, a wedding ring taped beneath gloves or hanging against his chest, a tattoo half covered by blood, a familiar voice sounding unfamiliar because pain had changed it. This is why the fear of losing someone before you could save them reached so deeply. It was tied to recognition. Soldiers were not trying to save an anonymous casualty. They were trying to save the person who had shared cigarettes, stories, arguments, snacks, bad jokes, and complaints about the heat. They were trying to keep the empty seat from staying empty after the mission. Sometimes the fear extended to blood itself, not as a sight, but as a resource. Severe trauma could require transfusion rapidly. Army stories from Afghanistan describe emergency blood donor programs and urgent calls for compatible donors on bases when wounded patients needed more blood than was immediately available. One 2012 Army report from Afghanistan described dozens of volunteers responding when wounded Afghan security personnel needed emergency transfusion support. Another report on Ranger medicine explained the Ranger Olo Titer program, which allowed a soldier to donate blood to a wounded comrade in minutes on the battlefield when needed. These examples show how close the act of saving a life could become. A soldier might not only help carry a casualty, he might literally become part of the treatment. There is a quiet intensity in that history. We often think of war as taking from the body. Here was a system built to give from the body under pressure. Blood from one person crossing into another because the ordinary supply chain was not enough, because minutes mattered, because someone refused to let a wounded man go without one more chance. The fear of losing someone before saving them helped drive these innovations. It pushed units to ask what else could be carried forward, what else could be trained, what else could be done before a casualty reached a hospital. Not every advance was dramatic in appearance. A better tourniquet, a better chest seal, a more practical training course, a smarter evacuation sequence. But these changes altered who lived. One of the most striking findings from the Afghanistan period was that once a casualty reached a Role 3 medical treatment facility alive, survival odds were extraordinarily high. The 2013 Joint Trauma System Assessment stated that US or coalition casualties who arrived alive at such facilities in Afghanistan had a survival probability greater than 98%. This fact gave soldiers a target. Get him there alive. Get her there breathing. Control the bleeding. Keep the airway open. Keep working until the helicopter lifts or the ambulance moves. The fear of losing someone before help arrived existed partly because everyone had learned how much could change if the casualty crossed that threshold still alive. That knowledge could make the first minutes feel even heavier. When soldiers understand that the hospital can often save the wounded, they begin to see the ground as the most unforgiving place in the chain. The battlefield becomes the narrow gate. The casualty either passes through it or does not. That is why commanders, medical leaders, and training institutions increasingly focused on pre-hospital trauma care during the war. The Joint Trauma System's concluding remarks in 2013 argued that reducing preventable combat death required both tactical and medical solutions, not one without the other. In plain language, a casualty could not be saved by medicine alone if no one could reach him, and no one could be kept alive by tactics alone if no one knew how to stop the bleeding. For the soldier trying to save a friend, all of that policy and doctrine disappeared into a simpler experience. Stay awake. Look at me. Breathe. The bird is coming. You're going to be all right. Sometimes those words were true. Sometimes they were spoken because there was nothing else worth saying while hands kept working. A rescuer might repeat the same phrase again and again, not only for the casualty, but to keep himself moving inside the task. Fear becomes less overwhelming when converted into action. Tighten, check, pack, hold, move, count, call, lift. None of those verbs erase what is happening, but they give the body a path through it. And then there were the moments when the effort failed. The casualty became still. The medic stopped briefly, checked again, and everyone around him already understood before anyone said it. In those moments, soldiers sometimes feared the silence more than the noise that had come before. The blast had been chaos. The firefight had been action. The attempted rescue had been urgency. The silence afterward felt like judgment, even when no one had done anything wrong. A piece of the unit had disappeared, and those who remained were left with blood on gloves, empty wrappers from medical supplies, a litter that no longer needed to move, and the knowledge that every second they had just lived would be reviewed internally for a very long time. The medical reports would later classify injuries, timing, and mechanisms of death. The soldiers would remember a face. This fear changed how people saw one another before missions. Soldiers checked each other's gear not only for mission readiness, but because someone might need that gear to survive. Tourniquets were carried where they could be reached quickly. Medical kits were arranged with purpose. Soldiers sometimes marked blood type information, rehearsed casualty drags, practiced radio calls, and talked through what would happen if a truck was hit or a patrol took casualties. These habits could seem repetitive, but repetition was the point. The unit was trying to reduce the amount of thinking required when fear arrived. Preparation could not guarantee survival. It could only make hesitation less likely. There is also a kind of love in this part of war that soldiers rarely describe with sentimental language. It appears through discipline, through carrying extra weight because someone may need it, through learning procedures no one hopes to use, through kneeling beside a friend in danger rather than stepping back, through donating blood when a call goes out, through medics training Afghan counterparts because the person bleeding tomorrow might not wear the same uniform, but still deserves a chance. The fear of losing someone before saving them exposed the harshest side of combat, but it also revealed how much of soldiering depended on refusing to abandon the wounded. Afghanistan left many soldiers with memories of casualties who lived because someone acted quickly. A tourniquet applied in time, a chest wound recognised, a medic arriving under fire, a helicopter launched fast enough, a transfusion arranged before the body crossed the point of no return. It also left memories of those who did not survive despite everything done correctly. Both kinds of memory shape the fear. One taught that action matters, the other taught that action has limits. Soldiers carried both truths into every mission after that. They knew saving someone was possible. They knew losing someone could happen anyway. That combination made the fear sharper, not softer. And once a unit had seen how quickly a friend could move from joking in the vehicle to fighting for breath in the dust, the hours outside the wire changed. Every patrol carried the possibility of that scene returning. Every quiet road, every village lane, every hillside crossing held not only the threat of attack, but the threat of what came after the attack. The worst moment might not be the blast itself. It might be kneeling beside someone you loved like family, doing everything you had been trained to do, and still wondering whether it would be enough before the sound of help reached you. Once the wounded had been lifted away, Once the helicopter noise faded and the dust began settling back onto helmets, uniforms, rifles, and the blood-darkened ground, the night did not end simply because the worst thing had already happened. That was another fear soldiers learned in Afghanistan. The world did not pause after a casualty. The patrol might still be outside the wire. The convoy might still need to move. The route might still be unsecured. The enemy might still be nearby. The radio might crackle with updates from medical channels. But the people remaining on the ground still had to turn their attention outward again, back toward the road, the walls, the fields, the hilltops, and the darkness that had been waiting there before everything changed. The long night continued, and in Afghanistan a long night outside the wire could feel longer than almost anything else. It is easy to think of darkness as emptiness, a lack of light, a quiet space between one day and the next. But for soldiers in Afghanistan, darkness was often crowded with things that could not be read clearly. It reduced distances, it erased details, it made familiar terrain unreliable. A wall that looked low by day became a black shape with no obvious end. A field became a flat uncertainty broken by irrigation ditches no one could see until a boot caught the edge. A village lane seemed narrower. A ridgeline seemed closer. A person standing still at 50 meters might disappear completely if he moved 2 steps sideways. Night vision devices gave coalition forces a real advantage, and units used that advantage deliberately in raids, patrols, and reconnaissance. But technology did not turn darkness into daylight. It changed darkness into something greener, grainier, and still incomplete. That distinction mattered. Soldiers often spoke of owning the night, and in some tactical situations they did enjoy overwhelming advantages over insurgents who lacked comparable equipment. Night vision goggles, thermal sights, infrared aiming systems, aircraft sensors, and disciplined coordination allowed coalition units to move, observe, and strike in darkness with a level of capability that had been unthinkable in earlier wars. Marines conducting a 2012 night raid in Helmand described using night vision and speed to achieve surprise against suspected insurgent sites. Afghan Special Operations Forces later developed stronger night capability of their own, and by 2016 US defense officials were publicly highlighting successful Afghan-led night raids supported by Afghan aviation. But a capability is not a guarantee. Owning the night in principle did not mean every patrol felt safe in practice. Picture a squad leaving a small base after sunset. The last red edge of daylight has disappeared. A few lights from the outpost fade behind them as they move through the gate and step into the dark country beyond. The soldiers are arranged in a line with spacing between them. Rifles are carried ready but not raised. Night vision goggles rest over one eye or both depending on the equipment. The world becomes monochrome. Mud walls glow pale green. The ground appears smoother than it really is. Depth can be deceptive. A ditch may be closer than it looks. A patch of brush may hide a break in the path. Someone in front pauses, the line slows, and every soldier behind him stops without needing to be told. No one wants metal to clink. No one wants to speak unnecessarily. The quieter the patrol becomes, the louder every small sound seems. Boots on grit, straps shifting, breathing, a dog beginning to bark somewhere they cannot see. Night patrols were not unusual in Afghanistan. They were part of the war's daily rhythm. Some units moved after dark to avoid predictability, some to approach suspected insurgent routes, some to provide security, some to conduct raids, some to clear roads before the next day's traffic, and some because darkness offered the best chance to get somewhere without being observed too early. Military histories and official accounts describe dismounted night patrols used to identify infiltration routes, Marines moving through villages at night, route clearance elements departing while it was still dark, and partner forces operating after sunset in contested districts. The night was not merely endured, it was actively used, but using it required living inside its risks. One army case study from Afghanistan captures this with unusual clarity. In 2009, First Lieutenant Daniel Bershinsky led a platoon on a dismounted night patrol intended to identify enemy infiltration routes before elections in Kandahar province. The platoon moved through fields, climbed walls, and struggled with terrain that became more and more restrictive in darkness. After nearly 5 hours, Bershinsky reported that the ground was terrible and that he feared being ambushed because the platoon could not see enough to protect itself. He imagined someone tossing a grenade over a wall and devastating the group before they could react. The patrol was called back. That moment matters because it strips away the illusion that night operations were always smooth expressions of technological dominance. Sometimes soldiers moved into the dark and discovered that the dark was winning. The fear of night ambushes was different from the fear of daytime contact. During daylight, a soldier might at least gain fragments of information quickly. Muzzle flashes, dust from shots, movement in a tree line, the shape of a man running between walls. At night, even with night optics, information arrived slowly and with less certainty. A flash might be seen without a clear shooter. A sound might echo strangely off hills or compounds. A figure on thermal imaging might be an armed fighter, a shepherd, or an animal, until the shape moved enough to clarify itself. The longer a unit stayed exposed, the more the fear widened. An enemy did not need perfect visibility to create danger. He needed to know where the patrol was likely to go, or to wait near a wall, a crossing, a gap, or a route that looked usable from the map but felt like a trap once boots were on the ground. Route clearance crews understood another side of the night. Insurgents often used darkness as cover to emplace IEDs, which meant engineers and security teams sometimes left before dawn to inspect routes that other units would use later. An army account from 2013 described route clearance vehicles rolling out while it was still dark, with soldiers using night vision devices, electronic jammers, and deliberate observation to search for explosives and avoid ambush. This was not glamorous work. It was slow work. Vehicles crept forward. Crews stared at roadsides, shoulders, culverts, and mountainsides. The goal was not to win a dramatic firefight. The goal was to stop the next patrol, convoy, Afghan police truck, or civilian car from finding a bomb by detonating it. Night made roads feel different as well. By day, a convoy could watch local traffic, villages, livestock, and the broader rhythm of a district. At night, that human context often vanished. A road might be nearly empty, which could be normal, or it could be empty because people knew something the convoy did not. Headlights were sometimes used, sometimes limited, sometimes filtered through tactical conditions. Night vision could help, but drivers still had to navigate dust, low visibility, tight roads, and the ever-present possibility that someone had worked under cover of darkness to alter the route. A military logistics patrol conducted under night vision conditions in Helmand in 2013 gives a sense of how common nighttime convoy movement had become, especially when resupplying forces in areas where daylight movement could be exposed or predictable. There was also the fear of losing direction. Maps never showed every wall, every footpath, every ditch, every makeshift barrier, or every newly blocked lane. GPS could place a patrol in the correct general area while still leaving the squad surrounded by terrain that made no sense from the ground. Darkness turned navigation mistakes into emotional strain very quickly. The wrong field could lead to a dead end. The wrong path could funnel soldiers between compounds. The wrong wall could force the patrol to climb where it should have gone around. Every unnecessary minute outside the wire increased exposure. This was especially difficult in agricultural areas where grape rows, irrigation channels, mud walls, and uneven ground reduced movement options. Official accounts from Afghanistan repeatedly show small units discovering that terrain at night was more restrictive than planners expected. Afghan partner forces often shared that long night with coalition troops, and their experience could be even more difficult when equipment was uneven. A military review article on Arghandab district described Afghan and American soldiers patrolling together by day and night, but noted that Afghan forces were significantly under-resourced in night vision devices. This caused problems during night patrols and base defense after dark, leading some US commanders to loan night vision equipment to Afghan soldiers, despite concerns over accountability of sensitive gear. That detail says a great deal about the practical reality of partnership. A joint patrol at night was only as strong as the ability of everyone in the formation to see, understand, and respond. If part of the patrol was effectively half-blind, the strain spread across the whole group. The darkness outside the wire was not always active. Sometimes the worst part was how little happened. Soldiers might establish a temporary observation post on a hillside or a rooftop and wait for hours. They watched a road, a field, a village edge, or a suspected movement corridor. They whispered only when needed. They shifted weight slowly to avoid noise. They felt the cold settle through gloves and sleeves. They wondered whether anyone below was watching them back. A watchtower at Combat Outpost Mushan in Panjwai gives a similar picture from the defensive side. A soldier looking out with night vision goggles across the surrounding plain, while rain leaked into the guard tower, discussing 48-hour rotations and the work of protecting roads from new IED placements. Waiting was not inactivity. It was a form of strain. On small bases and combat outposts, nighttime fear took a slightly different form. The walls offered protection, but not complete safety. Rockets and mortars could still arrive from outside the perimeter, often fired quickly and from a distance before the attackers fled. Marines operating near a dam in Afghanistan in 2004 reported that their base had been attacked with rockets and mortars, and a sergeant of the guard said insurgents tended to strike during the darkest hours before moonrise. This preference for darkness was not surprising. Darkness made launch sites harder to observe and reaction slower. For troops on base, the night could therefore contain two opposing feelings at once: relief at being inside the wire and awareness that the wire did not remove every threat. Anyone who has stood watch through the night knows that time behaves strangely. Minutes stretch. The first hour passes slowly, then the mind loses track. A watch shift from midnight to 4 in the morning can feel like a separate life, especially when the body is exhausted from previous patrols. In Afghanistan, night guard duty could require scanning barren ground, distant walls, or ridges where nothing appeared to move until suddenly something did. The soldier in the tower had to fight the body's desire to drift. The fear was partly of attack, but also of missing the beginning of attack. A dim shape, a brief flash, a vehicle where none should be, a person approaching too close. The consequences of inattention could be far larger than the sleepy mind wanted to admit. Night raids carried a different kind of tension. Their purpose was often to achieve surprise, and surprise required speed, coordination, and disciplined movement. Helicopters might insert troops before dawn. Ground elements might converge on compounds while the surrounding village still slept. Soldiers could use night vision and infrared systems to move with advantage. Yet the same darkness that concealed them could also conceal the people they were approaching. A Marine account from 2014 describes infantrymen inserting by helicopter under a black sky, moving across freshly tilled fields with night vision goggles and reaching compounds by sunrise before coming under enemy fire. This sequence reflects a basic truth of nighttime operations. Darkness could help a unit reach a target, but it did not guarantee what happened once the target area woke up. There was also a particular loneliness in being far from the base at night. During daytime missions, even difficult ones, the sun gave a sense of scale. You could see the landscape continuing beyond immediate danger. At night, the world contracted to what the goggles showed, what the radio carried, and what the person ahead of you did. A patrol in open country might feel as though it had been cut loose from the rest of the war. The base still existed behind them. Aircraft might be available. Other units might be monitoring, but emotionally, a small group moving through darkness could feel intensely alone. If contact came, they would handle the first seconds themselves. If a casualty occurred, they would stabilize him before anyone else arrived. If they became lost, they would solve it in the same darkness that created the problem. Some units pushed deep into valleys or villages and remained there overnight to continue patrolling without returning to a distant base after every mission. A Marine Corps historical account of operations in Afghanistan describes Dutch Marines moving on foot during the night and sleeping in local compounds during the day so they could patrol deeper into the Daehushan Valley. This kind of operating pattern extended reach, but it also meant sleeping in places far from the routines and barriers of a formal base. The night was no longer merely a window of movement. It became the environment itself surrounding the unit before, during and after the mission. For soldiers already burdened by the fears of IEDs, unseen enemies, doorways, insider threats and casualties, the long night outside the wire combined many dangers into one setting. The road might hold explosives, the fields might hide fighters, the compound ahead might contain the target, a sleeping family or both. The Afghan partner beside you might be struggling to see what you can see through your optics. The radio might suddenly report movement near the flank. The silence might mean nothing, or it might mean someone is waiting. Darkness made each previous fear harder to separate from the others. Everything blended. The ground, the stranger, the doorway, the ambush, the possibility of someone bleeding before dawn. And yet soldiers kept moving at night because the mission required it. They went out to clear roads before morning traffic. They went out to watch infiltration routes. They stood tower guard while others slept. They walked through fields under night vision devices toward compounds that needed to be searched. They patrolled with Afghan partners who were learning, adapting, and fighting beside them. They used darkness when darkness could help them, and endured it when darkness turned against them. The fear never disappeared completely. It settled into habits, double-checking batteries, adjusting goggles, stepping carefully over walls, speaking softly, counting silhouettes, noting where the moon was, knowing how much longer until dawn. Dawn was not always a triumph, but it was a relief. The first grey light returned depth to the world. Walls regained shape. Fields became visible. The road could be examined with ordinary eyes again. Soldiers could see one another's faces without the strange distortion of green optics. If they were still outside the wire, they often became aware of how tired they were only after the sky brightened. A night patrol that seemed tense and contained while it was happening could feel enormous once it was over. They had spent hours alert to dangers that might never show themselves, and that effort left its mark even when no shots were fired. Silence did not mean the night had been easy. It meant the patrol had carried its fear all the way through without the war choosing to reveal itself. For many soldiers, this became one of the memories that stayed. Not always the dramatic firefight, though those stayed too. Sometimes it was the long black road, the cold tower, the quiet field, the uncertain wall, the feeling that sunrise was taking far too long, the sensation of being trained, armed, and still not fully able to know what waited 20 meters away. Afghanistan had many kinds of darkness. Some came from policy, some from grief, some from decisions made too quickly or too slowly. But there was also the literal darkness of a patrol outside the wire, and for those who spent enough nights inside it, that darkness became a fear all its own. The plane landed, the doors opened, and for a little while everything looked like an ending. Families waited in gymnasiums, airport terminals, armories and hangars with handmade signs. Restless children, flowers, cameras and faces already wet before the first soldier stepped into view. Boots crossed polished floors instead of gravel. Rucksacks dropped. A child who had learned to speak during deployment suddenly ran toward a parent who had missed the first words. A spouse wrapped both arms around a uniform and held on longer than the cameras expected. Friends clapped. Commanders spoke. Flags hung from the walls. Someone played music too loudly through a bad speaker. There were hugs so forceful they looked almost painful. There were soldiers smiling with the strained disbelief of people who had spent months planning to come home and had still not quite accepted that it happened. For many who served in Afghanistan, that return was one of the happiest days of their lives. But it was not always the moment the war ended. Sometimes it was the moment the war became quieter, harder to explain, and easier for everyone else to miss. A person can leave Afghanistan in a matter of hours. The mind does not always travel at the same speed. For months, and sometimes for years, soldiers had lived inside habits designed for danger. They scanned roads for disturbed dirt. They watched hands more than faces. They noticed parked vehicles, rooftops, culverts, sudden quiet, sudden crowds, the angle of a doorway, the change in a village's mood. They slept lightly because alarms mattered. They woke fast because hesitation had consequences. Then they came home to grocery stores, parking lots, school pickup lines, restaurants, cinemas, family gatherings, and suburban streets where almost no one else was interpreting the world that way. The body did not always understand immediately that it was allowed to stop. A veteran might sit in a restaurant and choose the chair with a view of the entrance without thinking about it. He might tense when a car drifted too close on the highway. She might wake instantly at a slammed door, already alert before the conscious mind remembered there was no patrol leaving the gate. These reactions did not happen to everyone, and they did not all mean illness. But they reveal how war can continue as a set of trained responses after the visible war is gone. VA materials on deployment stress note that sleep problems and related symptoms can be especially troublesome for newer veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq. Sleep was often where the difference between being home and feeling home became most obvious. During deployment, fatigue had been expected. Soldiers slept when they could, where they could, and rarely under ideal conditions. Coming home did not automatically restore rest. Some veterans struggled to fall asleep because the house felt too quiet. Others woke repeatedly or dreamed in fragments of roads, gunfire, helicopters, blasts, body armour or faces from deployment. The National Centre for PTSD has long described sleep problems as common among veterans with PTSD, and broader VA material on combat exposure notes that returning troops from Afghanistan and Iraq faced elevated risk for post-traumatic stress and other mental health challenges. Again, this does not mean every veteran came home broken. Many did not. Many adjusted, resumed work, raised families, built careers, and remembered their service without being overtaken by it. But enough struggle that the problem became one of the major health histories of the post-9/11 wars. The numbers vary depending on the study, the population, and how symptoms are measured, but the pattern is clear. VA research found that 15.7% of deployed Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom veterans screened positive for PTSD in one major study, compared with 10.9% of non-deployed veterans in the same research. VA's National Centre for PTSD has summarised research suggesting that roughly 10 to 18% of troops returning from those wars were likely to experience PTSD, while a separate VA research review cited an average prevalence estimate of about 23% across studies of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. These figures do not describe every soldier, and they should not be treated as a single definitive number. They do show that a meaningful share of those who served brought significant psychological burdens home with them. For some veterans, the war followed them home through injury that was not always visible. Afghanistan was a blast-heavy conflict. Roadside bombs, vehicle blasts, indirect fire, breaching charges, and other explosive exposures created repeated risks of concussion and traumatic brain injury. A 2025 article from the Military Health System stated that as many as 1 in 5 service members may have experienced possible traumatic brain injury during combat deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. The effects could be obvious in some cases and difficult to identify in others. Headaches, memory problems, irritability, difficulty concentrating, light sensitivity, disrupted sleep, and changes in mood could overlap with PTSD or other conditions, making the line between physical injury and psychological strain hard to separate cleanly. VA and Defense Department research after the wars increasingly treated traumatic brain injury and psychological health as linked concerns rather than neatly isolated categories. This made homecoming complicated in ways families did not always expect. A soldier might look physically unchanged in the doorway and still feel altered. A spouse who had spent months imagining relief could suddenly find themselves living beside someone quieter, quicker to anger, less patient with noise, or emotionally distant in ways neither person knew how to name. Children might be thrilled that a parent was back and then confused when that parent seemed uneasy in crowds, slept during the day, or withdrew after certain sounds. VA research and family support materials have long recognised that post-deployment stress can affect spouses, caregivers, and household relationships, not only the veteran directly. The war sometimes entered the home through arguments about small things that were not really small, through silence at dinner, through the difficulty of explaining that nothing particular was wrong, and yet something had not settled. Reintegration itself became a serious subject of study because returning was not the same as resuming. A VA-supported study found that 54% of the broader OEF/OIF/OND veteran population reported at least a little difficulty reintegrating, with higher rates among veterans who used VA healthcare. Another VA research summary reported that an estimated 40% of combat veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who used VA medical services perceived some to extreme overall difficulty readjusting to civilian life within the previous month. These findings do not mean that half of all veterans were unable to function. That would be misleading. They do show that the simple phrase "back to normal" did not fit a great many lives. Normal had changed while they were away. They had changed while normal continued without them. Some difficulties were practical. A service member returned to a civilian job and found that the urgency of office problems felt strange after decisions overseas had involved lives, security, and survival. A veteran enrolled in college and discovered that crowded lecture halls, casual complaints, or easy talk about war could feel grating. Someone who had led people in combat came home and felt oddly powerless dealing with paperwork, appointments, and insurance forms. Others missed the clarity of deployment more than they expected. Not the danger, necessarily, and not the losses, but the sense that each day had purpose, structure, and people whose lives were tied directly to one another. Civilian life could feel loose by comparison. That contrast made some veterans feel guilty, as though missing parts of deployment meant they had forgotten what it cost. In reality, many missed the cohesion, the certainty of role, and the intense closeness of a small team. VA reintegration research has repeatedly focused on these broader adjustment challenges because they affected work, family life, and community belonging. Then there was grief, which didn't always arrive on schedule. During deployment, grief could be delayed by necessity. A friend was killed, and the unit still had missions. A memorial was held, boots and rifle displayed, a helmet placed above them, dog tags hanging, a photograph nearby. People stood still, saluted, listened, and then returned to the machinery of the war. There were vehicles to maintain, patrols to prepare, reports to finish, gear to sort, next movements to plan. Home sometimes created the first real space in which grief had room to expand. A veteran might be driving alone months later when a song from deployment came on, or unpacking a box and finding a photograph, or watching a child reach the age a fallen friend never would. The mind could hold itself together in combat and loosen later when the surrounding world assumed the hard part was over. The fear of losing someone before saving them, which soldiers carried in Afghanistan, often became the sorrow of remembering exactly who was not present at the homecoming. This pattern is consistent with the broader clinical understanding that deployment-related trauma and loss may become more visible after return, especially when the pace of life slows and external demands shift. For others, the pain was not only grief, but guilt. Why him and not me? Why did I come home when she did not? Why did the interpreter who helped us not get out? Why did we leave that district after all those months? Why did the village fall again? Why did the evacuation look the way it did in August 2021? These questions did not trouble everyone, and they did not all arise in the same way. But after the fall of Kabul and the chaotic US withdrawal, VA officials publicly acknowledged that some veterans might experience intense emotional reactions connected to the outcome of the war. A VA psychologist described the unfolding events in Afghanistan as something that could be experienced by some veterans as a form of moral injury, with the potential to weigh heavily on them. VA issued resources specifically encouraging veterans and families to talk about their reactions to the withdrawal. Moral injury is not identical to PTSD, and it is important not to turn it into a loose catch-all phrase. It generally refers to the distress that can arise when people feel they have violated, failed to uphold, or witnessed the violation of deeply held moral beliefs. For some Afghanistan veterans, the unresolved questions of the war, the fate of Afghan partners, civilian suffering, choices made under pressure, or the eventual collapse of the Afghan government after 2 decades of sacrifice became part of that burden. VA sponsored a systematic review in 2024 examining moral injury and mental health among service members and veterans, reflecting how seriously the subject has been taken in post-war research. The 2021 withdrawal gave those questions a new public urgency because it invited many veterans to revisit the meaning of their service all at once, often through images on television that seemed to compress 20 years into a few chaotic days. It is worth staying with that for a moment, because history is often unfair to the people who lived it. Public debate tends to sort wars into success or failure, justified or unjustified, victory or defeat. Soldiers do not always experience their service in those categories. A veteran may feel pride in protecting a unit, saving a friend, building trust with Afghan partners, or helping a village in a small but real way. The same veteran may also feel anger about strategic decisions, sorrow for those left behind, and confusion about what the larger war achieved. These feelings can coexist without cancelling one another. VA's public messaging after the withdrawal tried to make room for that complexity, urging Afghanistan veterans to recognise both the value of their service and the difficulty of reconciling it with how the war ended. The war followed some veterans home through substance misuse, isolation, and worsening mental health. VA materials on combat exposure have noted concerns about excessive drinking and tobacco use among OEF/OIF veterans, and broader reintegration studies identified distress, anger, and social difficulty as common concerns in subsets of returning service members. Again, these are not universal outcomes. They are patterns visible in enough people to matter historically. A veteran might drink to fall asleep, then realise sleep is not rest. Someone else might avoid friends because answering questions about deployment feels exhausting. Another might stop attending family events because crowded rooms feel too loud and unpredictable. The problem is not always that civilians ask the wrong question. Sometimes the problem is that no brief answer can hold the truth. How was Afghanistan? Is almost impossible to answer in a doorway, over coffee, or at a holiday table. There were also veterans who found purpose in helping others carry the load. Some became peer mentors. Some worked with Afghan refugees after 2021. Some entered medicine, counselling, public service, or advocacy. Some returned to school precisely because they wanted to build a life beyond the war. Others stayed in uniform and tried to teach younger service members what they had learned. It would be wrong to tell this part of the story only through injury and sorrow. The Afghanistan generation produced remarkable resilience as well as deep pain. VA and other veteran support systems increasingly emphasised connection, peer support, family engagement and treatment access, because recovery was not imagined as a solitary act of will. It was understood as something many people needed help navigating, and often did navigate successfully when support reached them. Still, the burden remained serious enough that the country could not honestly pretend homecoming closed the book. the Department of Veterans Affairs has continued to publish national suicide prevention reporting, including a 2025 annual report using data through 2023, because suicide among veterans remains a grave public health concern. That report is not a tally of Afghanistan veterans alone, and it should not be misused as though one war explains every suicide. But it belongs in this history because the post-9/11 era forced military institutions, families and the public to confront the long-term human costs of repeated deployments, traumatic exposure, injury, and difficult reintegration more openly than before. The war after the war was not identical for everyone. It was not always visible, but it was real. Perhaps the hardest part was that ordinary life could appear to move faster than healing. Bills still arrived, children still needed rides, marriages still required patience, parents aged, jobs demanded focus. People outside the veterans' immediate circle often expected gratitude, relief and closure. A veteran might feel all three and still struggle. The homecoming ceremony had happened. The uniform was hanging in a closet. The deployment bags had been emptied. The photos had been posted. But the nervous system had its own schedule, and memory did not care whether the calendar said enough time had passed. For some, the war returned in noise. For others, in silence. For others, in sudden anger, numbness, headaches, insomnia, or a reluctance to speak about things that seemed too large for casual conversation. VA's post-deployment and PTSD resources repeatedly stress that these experiences can affect veterans and families long after the deployment itself is over. And yet many veterans kept building lives around those memories rather than surrendering to them. They learned which days were hard. They told stories when ready and kept others private. They found other veterans who did not require translation. They sought treatment. They avoided treatment for years and then finally went. They became parents whose children knew Afghanistan only as a word attached to photographs and old gear. They walked across grocery store parking lots, scanning less than they used to. They slept better in some seasons and worse in others. They carried names. They carried places. They carried the faces of Afghans who had worked beside them. They carried pride, anger, sorrow, humour and disbelief that so much time had passed. History often prefers clean conclusions. The lives of veterans rarely provide them. That is why the war that followed them home belongs in any honest account of what soldiers feared most in Afghanistan. Fear did not always end at the edge of a patrol route. It did not always leave when the helicopter lifted, or when the base gate closed behind them for the last time, or when a family embraced them beneath fluorescent lights in a crowded gymnasium. Sometimes the deepest fear emerged afterward, when there was no mission brief to occupy the mind and no convoy schedule to obey. It was the fear of not feeling like oneself, the fear of forgetting too much or remembering too clearly, the fear of becoming difficult to love, the fear that the war had changed something permanent. And beneath all of that sat another question, quieter but persistent, one that soldiers often carried from Afghanistan into the years beyond it. When they thought back on what had frightened them most, was it really death, or was it something more complicated than death ever sounded from far away? If you asked a soldier in Afghanistan what frightened him most, he might not answer immediately. Not because there was no answer, but because there were too many answers, and the obvious one was not always the truest. Death was real. No honest account of that war can pretend otherwise. The United States' nearly 20-year mission in Afghanistan involved more than 800,000 American service members and 25,000 civilians, and by the end of the military evacuation in August 2021, 2,461 US service members and civilians had been killed, while more than 20,000 had been injured. Those numbers are large enough to become abstract when read quickly, but they were never abstract to the people who lived inside them. They were names in briefing rooms, empty bunks, folded flags, memorial services on dusty bases, boots placed beside rifles, voices missing from radio traffic, birthdays that stopped arriving. Death was present throughout the war, and soldiers understood that. Yet when fear settled deepest, it was often attached not to the thought of dying, but to the thought of failing someone else before death arrived. A soldier riding in a convoy knew the road could kill him, but the fear tightening his chest was often that the bomb would strike the vehicle behind his, or the one carrying the newest private, or the one driven by a friend whose wife had just sent photographs of a newborn child. A squad leader entering a village knew a gunman might be waiting behind a doorway. But the fear that stayed with him might be that he would hesitate too long and lose one of his soldiers, or react too quickly and injure a civilian who had done nothing wrong. An advisor training Afghan forces knew that insider attacks existed. But what made that fear corrosive was not only personal danger, it was the possibility that trust itself, the thing the mission required, could collapse in an instant. A medic kneeling beside a wounded man understood he could be shot next. Yet the more immediate fear was often that his hands would not be fast enough, that the bleeding would not stop, that the helicopter would not arrive before the body beside him began to slip away. This is why the fear of death, while obvious, does not fully explain what war in Afghanistan felt like from within. Death is final. The fears soldiers carried were often about responsibility before finality. They feared missing the sign. They feared choosing the wrong path. They feared giving the wrong order. They feared failing to cover the correct sector. They feared not spotting the pressure plate. They feared not understanding a village fast enough. They feared what might happen because of a decision made in a second that would be reviewed for years inside their own minds. Much of the war forced soldiers into situations where caution and urgency pulled against each other. Move too slowly and the enemy escapes, strikes first, or harms someone nearby. Move too quickly and you may misunderstand what you're seeing. That kind of fear is different from the fear of being shot. It follows people because it attaches itself to memory, judgment, and conscience. In the quietest version of that fear, a soldier imagined being the one who let the group down. Military culture places enormous value on reliability. You are expected to carry your weight, remain alert, and not become the weak link when the pressure rises. That expectation can create pride, discipline, and remarkable courage. It can also create a private dread. What if I freeze? What if I do not hear the call? What if I step in the wrong place? What if I become the reason someone else does not go home? These were not melodramatic worries. They were natural thoughts in a war where explosions came from beneath ordinary roads. Gunfire came from compounds that looked quiet. Moments earlier, and a medical emergency could unfold faster than language. Army oral history projects from the Afghanistan war were built precisely because individual experiences mattered, and because the conflict could not be understood only through strategy documents and official summaries. The people who served remembered the war in personal immediate units: patrols, attacks, failures, narrow escapes, teammates, and responsibilities that never fit neatly into a chart. There is a reason so many acts of valour in Afghanistan centred on retrieving the wounded, remaining with the wounded, shielding others, or refusing to leave someone behind. Military institutions celebrate those acts because they represent the highest ideals of service, but they also reveal something about the deepest fears. Soldiers feared abandonment, not being abandoned themselves necessarily, but abandoning someone else through inability, delay, or failure. In moments of combat, the promise that no one would be left behind was not sentimental decoration. It was one of the moral foundations that made the danger bearable. A person might accept the possibility of being wounded more easily than the possibility of watching a friend die alone because help could not reach him. That is why the chapters of this war that soldiers remembered most clearly often involved names, not tactics. Who was hit? Who carried him? Who called the medevac? Who stayed beside him? Who did not make it? Death was feared, of course, but death could also be absorbed into a soldier's understanding of the job in ways outsiders find hard to understand. Some troops spoke openly, even bluntly, about knowing that not everyone would come back. One 2011 military review essay about advisors in Afghanistan quoted a sergeant saying that some of them would not return and that they understood the risk. That does not mean soldiers wanted death, or that grief was easy, or that such statements represented everyone. It does show that for certain troops, personal danger was not the most complicated part of the mission. They had accepted that danger existed. What remained more troubling was whether they would perform well within it, whether they would protect those beside them, and whether their choices would remain livable afterward. Afghanistan placed soldiers in morally difficult spaces more often than many people at home realised. The war was fought among civilians, in villages, on roads used by farmers and children, inside homes where families slept, and around institutions that were difficult to distinguish cleanly from the local pressures surrounding them. A soldier might fire in self-defence and still spend years wondering about what he saw. Another might obey restraint and watch an enemy escape, then learn later that someone else was harmed. A medic might save 3 people and remember only the 4th. A commander might know that a decision was tactically justified and still remain haunted by the consequences. These are not signs of weakness. They are evidence of moral seriousness under conditions where no option is perfectly clean. This is where the language of moral injury becomes important, even though the phrase can sound clinical compared with the experience itself. VA researchers describe moral injury as distress connected to perceived violations of deeply held moral beliefs. It can involve guilt, shame, self-condemnation, or anguish over killing, witnessing death, or failing to prevent actions one believes were wrong. Researchers distinguish it from PTSD, while also noting that the two can overlap, and that moral injury-related experiences have been linked to serious mental health outcomes among veterans and service members. That framework matters here because it helps explain why some soldiers feared not only the event in front of them, but the person they might become afterward if they survived it. The terror was not always, "Will I die?" Sometimes it was, "Will I be able to live with what happens next?" That fear could form in a single moment or accumulate slowly. A patrol passed through a village and later learned that an interpreter who had helped them was threatened. A soldier watched Afghan partners fight bravely while wondering what would happen to them after coalition forces left. A unit lost someone during a mission that seemed ordinary until it was not. Years later, images from Kabul in August 2021 reopened questions for some veterans about sacrifice, purpose, and the meaning of what they had done. VA researchers and clinicians noted at the time that the withdrawal and Taliban takeover could be experienced by some Afghanistan veterans as morally injurious, adding another burden to existing reintegration challenges. That does not describe every veteran, and it should not be flattened into a single national emotion. But it reveals how the war continued to evolve inside memory after the formal end of combat operations. There is also a fear that belongs uniquely to survivors, not only surviving an attack, but surviving the whole deployment, coming home and discovering that what once felt sharp and manageable abroad becomes difficult to organise in ordinary life. A soldier may know exactly what to do during an ambush and have no idea how to explain his silence at a family dinner. She may remain composed while treating a casualty, and then find herself angry at a harmless inconvenience months later. He may function well at work, laugh with friends, and still avoid certain sounds, certain news footage, certain photographs. The war does not follow everyone home in the same way, but when it does, it often reveals that fear was never limited to the battlefield. Some soldiers feared that they would return physically intact and still never feel fully free of the war. VA research after the Afghanistan withdrawal explicitly described the emotional burden that some post-9/11 veterans carried as they processed the war's ending. When people who have not served imagine battlefield fear, they often picture the moment just before combat, the soldier wondering whether he will survive the next minute. That image is not wrong, but it is incomplete. A more accurate picture might include a lieutenant at night, unable to see enough terrain to feel confident that his platoon is safe. a young private scanning a dirt road and trying not to miss the thing that could kill the vehicle behind him. A sergeant outside a doorway, aware that he has perhaps 1 second to decide whether a shape in a dark room is a threat. An advisor attending a meeting with Afghan counterparts, while a guardian angel quietly watches the space. A medic telling a friend to stay awake while doing everything trained hands know to do. A veteran years later watching footage from Kabul and feeling sadness under anger. None of these fears are cleanly about personal death. They are about uncertainty, duty, judgment, and attachment. Attachment is perhaps the most important word of all. Soldiers feared losing one another because they had become bound to one another through repetition. Meals eaten together, missions survived together. Complaints repeated until they became jokes. Shared silence in vehicles. Arguments over small nonsense because the larger things were too large to touch casually. A unit is not a family in every sense, and soldiers themselves can be quick to resist cliches about brotherhood when civilians use them too easily. Still, combat creates forms of dependence that ordinary life rarely demands. Your sleep, your movement, your survival, your ability to breathe through a bad moment can become tied to people you did not know a year earlier. Fear grows where attachment grows. Death was terrifying because of separation. Wounding was terrifying because of helplessness. Mistakes were terrifying because they could injure those bonds. This is why the question, what soldiers feared most during the war in Afghanistan, does not have one neat answer. Some feared IEDs above everything else. Some feared being ambushed in terrain they did not understand. Some feared doors and rooms, and some feared insider attacks. Some feared medevac delays. Some feared making a decision they would regret forever. Some feared coming home altered in ways their families could not see. The exact answer varied by person, role, deployment, province, and year. A Marine in Helmand in 2010 may have remembered the road differently from an Army advisor in 2012. An Air Force rescue crew member, a medic, a convoy driver, or a soldier at Kabul airport in 2021. But across those differences, a pattern appears. The fears that stayed longest were often the fears that involved someone else. Not merely, what happens to me? But, what happens because of me? And, what happens if I cannot protect them? The war forced soldiers to live repeatedly inside those questions. It is tempting from a distance to reduce courage to the absence of fear. History gives us countless statues, speeches, and commemorations that can sound that way if we do not listen carefully. Yet the Afghanistan war, like every serious war, shows something more human. Courage was not the disappearance of fear. It was movement while fear remained. It was the driver keeping the truck steady on a road he distrusted. The patrol stepping through another village after the last one had turned violent. The advisor continuing to work with Afghan partners after insider attacks had made that trust harder. The helicopter crew flying toward gunfire because someone on the ground had only minutes. The medic reaching into a wound because stillness would be worse. Courage did not cancel fear. It gave fear a task to stand beside, and there is one final distinction worth making. Death is feared because it ends a life. But many soldiers in Afghanistan feared failure because it could shape a life that continued. Death belonged to the body. Failure, whether real or imagined, belonged to memory. A soldier could survive a blast and carry the image of who did not. A medic could save many and remain fixed on the one who slipped away. A leader could bring most of the patrol home and still dream about the route he chose. A veteran could know rationally that the collapse of the Afghan government in 2021 was not his personal responsibility, and still feel grief, anger, or moral confusion about people and places he had invested years of effort in. VA research into moral injury and the post-withdrawal emotional burden among veterans exists because these experiences are neither rare enough nor simple enough to dismiss. So when we ask what soldiers feared most, perhaps the honest answer is that they feared the moment when love, duty, and uncertainty collided. The roadside bomb was terrifying because it could take a friend without warning. The unseen gunman was terrifying because he could strike before the unit understood what was happening. The doorway was terrifying because one decision could harm the innocent or leave comrades exposed. The insider attack was terrifying because it poisoned trust. The wounded soldier was terrifying because saving him might depend on seconds. The long night outside the wire was terrifying because everything known by day became harder to read. The war after homecoming was terrifying because it suggested that survival did not automatically mean release. Death was there throughout the Afghanistan war. It deserves to be named plainly and remembered without softening. But death was not always the fear that shaped soldiers most deeply. Often it was the fear of being too late to see the wire, too late to pull a friend clear, too late to understand a doorway, too late to stop a betrayal, too late to save someone whose voice had been steady only moments before. And sometimes, long after the deployment ended, too late to return to the person they had been before any of it began. That is the part of war that official timelines cannot fully record. They can tell us when operations began and ended. They can count the dead, the wounded, the years, the units, the bases, the aircraft, the withdrawals. They cannot completely measure the private burden of responsibility carried by the people who move through those years one patrol at a time. But history becomes more honest when we try to see it. Not only the danger soldiers faced, but the things they feared losing while facing it. Not only their own lives, but one another. Not only the body, but judgment. Not only the moment of death, but the long memory of what happened just before it.